Damien, over to you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our December conference this morning. Just a few words about PARC and the events and this year and plans for the future. The Participatory Autism Research Collective, or PARC for short, was set up in 2015 when I was working with Nicki on a project at London South Bank University. And it started off with 5 people in a room discussing the need for participatory research in the field and wanting to build a supportive network. And one of the main things we wanted to do was put on events and workshops and share research and knowledge in this area. And it's been growing bigger ever since. And we were holding many in-person events, workshops, conference events, and so on over a number of years. And this was hit quite badly in 2020 by the whole COVID situation. And many events were cancelled that year or postponed. But this year we've managed to move all our events online, and they've been exceedingly successful and really interesting events through the year. We've had an autism journal club partnering the University of Kent, and that's held 5 events so far over the year. And we had such a high number of quality submissions for our annual Critical Autism Studies conference that we've ended up with 3 online conferences this year, one in the summer, one in the autumn, and now our winter conference. So it's been a very, very busy year for us. But it's been a really exciting one. And it gives us a bit of a dilemma for the future, because as PARC expands and the network gets bigger, there's more and more people wanting to share their work and meet one another and all this sort of thing. So how do we manage this as it gets bigger? So this is something we're going to have to think about as we move forward. But what we have today is a very interesting and very varied set of presentations. We tried to kind of have the sessions so the 2 presentations with the Q&A have some level of similarity in the areas they're looking at. Little bit different with our first session this morning, and that's partly because Susie was going to present at our autumn conference, but unfortunately wasn't able to then, but we managed to fit her in at the beginning of today's conference. So I'm really glad to be able to introduce our first speaker shortly, and partly because I work with Susie myself, because I'm one of her supervisors for her PhD at the moment at the University of Kent. So, and I'll let Susie explain in a few minutes what her talk this morning is going to be about. But yeah, quite a varied range of topic areas today. So the last few events have been brilliant, and I think that today's just going to be just as good. No pressure on the speakers, but it's been lovely to have such topics covered, and the discussed in the chat and so on. So over to Nicki just to explain a little bit about the work at London South Bank University and how that connects to PARC.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Damian. And I just want to really pay tribute to the work that Damian does, as well as the other people who are associated with PARC, because as he said, it did start off with a little idea, but it's a big thing now. And if you look at the chat, you'll see we've got people, international scholars from all over the world, really. I just saw somebody popped up from Australia just there. And we've got people from all sorts of different roles within education, health, social services. Like, for example, I just saw somebody who is in adult services in a local authority, which is really interesting. One of the great things about these PARC events is the networking that happens as well, because I see, for example, Shona, your PhD is around parenting. There's somebody called Paula Sanchez, who is a PhD student that Damian and I both supervise, who's well into her PhD, who's also looking at autistic motherhood. And I just think, get these people together, get these people together. And there's so much of those opportunities available to us through this method of communication via these online conferences, which is brilliant. So use the chat to keep in touch with people. That is really important. At the last event, for example, one of our speakers gave a fantastic presentation about all sorts of funding that community groups and charity groups could access in order to develop their whatever initiatives they were involved in. I thought that's really interesting for PARC, because PARC is completely unfunded. You know, everybody just does it, which is not ideal, but that's how it is. And it was also very interesting for one of our projects. So in the 4 minutes available to me, I'll just tell you about projects which we've got going funded within the Critical Autism and Disabilities Studies Research Group at London South Bank University, because they may be of interest to people here. We've got 2 projects currently funded by John and Lorna Wing, both of which focus on well-being more than anything else. One of them is about annual GP health checks and doctors' attitudes towards carrying out these health checks for people with autism and intellectual impairments. And one of our principals is autistic researchers, and Dr. Nick Chown is in charge of that project. But part of our steering group is something called Autistic Doctors International. And there's actually a group of 400 plus autistic doctors who actually are collaborating together on research and so on, very aware of PARC, very interested in PARC. And our other project that we've got going, we're just about to report on, is about the health and well-being and social inclusion of autistic adults over 45 who have carers. And obviously the pandemic massively impacted upon people from that sort of demographic. But loads of PhD students at South Bank and doctoral students taking professional doctorates looking at autism in relation to education, parenting, health, etc., etc. So there's an awful lot going on. But what I'd say is the main principle of our research group is properly paid and supported, absolute forefront of all the research that we do. I've just got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to close now with a big thank you, of course, to Neil, because if Neil wasn't absolutely brilliant, we wouldn't be able to do this. And we've done it loads of times without a hitch, and that's because he goes above and beyond. You know, he's not dedicated to our team. He's responsible for all the online events for all the university all the time. And I don't know how he manages to make this so perfect for us every time. So I'll end there because my time is up, but have a great day, everybody, and keep communicating with each other. One more thing, sorry, 30 seconds. The Research Excellence Framework talks about international collaborations and writing papers jointly with international partners. We need to be thinking about that for PARC. So let's try and collaborate internationally in relation to writing as well. And PARC does things like workshops around writing for publication, collaborative research, etc., etc. So please use the chat to make those connections with people with like interests. And that's me done now. And we're going to move on to the first speaker, which I assume you're going to introduce, Damian.
Yeah, thanks, Nicki.
Thank you.
I think you're just breaking up a bit there, so you might want to turn camera off later or something to help. Just to second that about Neil's help, been brilliant, and we wouldn't have been able to do these online conferences this year without that help. So it's really appreciated by us all. So introducing our first speaker, we have Susie Bass, and talking on the development of positive attitudes of mainstream teaching staff towards autistic students. Over to you, Susie.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Susie. I'm going to share my screen and then turn my camera off. Okay, so as Damian said, I'm Susie. I'm working with Damian on my PhD at the Tizard Centre of University of Kent. I'm an autistic parent of autistic teenagers, and I work as a teacher in further education. Today, I'm presenting the results of my master's dissertation in autism studies, which explored developing positive attitudes of mainstream teaching staff towards autistic students. I completed my research in 2018 to 2020 and used some resources that predate those dates. In some of the resources, the language relating to autism studies is not 100% as perhaps we would hope it to be. The language is continuously updating. However, there are some references that do use outdated terms. So I do apologize in advance for those because they will appear on screen. Where possible during our project, we did use identity first language and positive language towards autistic people. I also have some images in this presentation, and they are by Eliza Fricker, which is this first one here, and another artist called Esther Whitney. Both are very talented artists, and I've used their images because they really captured the message that I was trying to get across in my research. So we all have some experience of education and are able to recall perhaps one particular teacher that had an impact on us while we were in our education. That could be positive or it could be negative. And throughout the presentation, if you would like to contribute to a discussion about what constitutes positive attitudes, I would love to see those comments in the chat. So I'm starting with inclusive education and an image by Esther Whitney, which she says describes how she felt while she was at school. The right to inclusive education for those who want to attend mainstream settings is supported by international policy, Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Inclusion relies on resources and attitudes of teachers and support staff, and there is often conflict between inclusion policy and the Raising Standards agenda, which was discussed by Todd and Ellis in 2014. Without appropriate support, education can be difficult for autistic students. So Article 24 is very much about inclusion. And so to provide some context for how that might be experienced by young people in education, I've got some definitions here, starting with exclusion, where students are denied access to education. And this can include permanent, fixed term, or informal exclusion. Segregation, where students are taught in separate environments in isolation from students without disabilities, and increasingly popular in schools. At the moment, we have isolation units where students are sent to work in and segregated from the other students. Integration, which is placing students in mainstream education settings without adaptation, and the focus is on the student to fit in. And then finally, full inclusion, which is the design of the environment, teaching and curriculum are all adapted to make them accessible to all students. So the background of my research looked at a report that was written in 2017 on how the education system works for autistic people. And it was produced by the all-party parliamentary group on autism. Some of the findings I presented on the screen here. So 3 years from the introduction of significant reforms to the special educational needs system in England, children on the autism spectrum are still being let down by the education system. 6 in 10 young people and 7 in 10 of their parents say the main thing that would make school better for them is having a teacher who understands autism. And fewer than 5 in 10 teachers say that they are confident about supporting a child on the autism spectrum. Next, I have some views that were included in this report. So starting with a parent, and sadly, this is very similar to my own experience, and also the reason that I wasn't able to present at the autumn conference is that we are stuck in a system that wants the child to fail before help is offered. And sadly, my daughter went to university in September and has also left and has been failed again by the education system. Then we have the view of a young person. The school shattered my confidence. They had no understanding. They were unable to provide reasonable adjustments. And finally, I have the perspective of a professional. This situation is leading to huge inequalities and unmet needs that will potentially lead to school exclusion, placements in special provision, and escalating costs for the local authority. So that was my starting point for my research. I also looked at some recent reports about inclusive education. I'm based in Kent, which is where my children go to school. And in 2019, there was a joint inspection report by Ofsted and QCQ, which found that too many children have weak education and healthcare plans. Many children and young people have documents that do not accurately reflect their needs because up-to-date information was not gathered. And they gave an example of one 15-year-old's education and healthcare plan, which was based on a report he received when he was age 3. Other reports that have criticised inclusion of autistic students has been the House of Commons Education Committee report in 2019, which was the first report after the reforms. The Timpson review of school exclusions, and I have some details coming up on that on a slide in a minute. And then finally, in 2020, the Global Education Monitoring Report Inclusion and Education found that across the world, this is an issue that students with additional needs are finding that they are not fully included in education. This is another image by Esther, which is describing how she felt about inclusion from her peers when she was at school. So the current practice and training in the United Kingdom is that there's no mandatory training for qualified teachers. There's only 2.5 hours of training for teachers on initial teacher training programs. And at the time of writing my dissertation, SENCOs were only required to complete training within 3 years of starting the role, which means that there are some SENCOs in place without any training. And I work in further education, where at the moment a SENCO is not a mandatory role. So now I'm looking at exclusion and giving a context of how difficult it can be for some students in mainstream education. In 2017, 2018, 164 autistic students with either statements of special educational needs, which predates education and healthcare plans, were permanently excluded from school. And 11,627 received fixed period exclusions. There was also informal exclusions, and these are often referred to as off-rolling, which are not recorded at a national level. However, a recent report by the Education Policy Institute estimated the number of pupils to have experienced at least one explained exit during their 5 years of secondary education to be 61,123 for the year 11 cohort, and that was in 2017. So what we did for my project was asked teachers and teaching staff to fill out some questionnaires, receive some training, and then do the questionnaires again. And we had 4 research questions, which were: does the training that we provided increase openness towards autistic students? Does it increase self-efficacy, so their confidence in working with students? Does it increase positive attitudes towards inclusion? And does it increase perceived knowledge and actual knowledge? So I had a number of issues with my dissertation and my research project, the most significant being that just a few days before my face-to-face training session, the lockdown was introduced, which meant I had to completely redesign my project in March 2020. We ended up sending out the questionnaires in a link and used Qualtrics to record the information. We created a training video which included a lot of opinions about education from autistic people and some links to videos about lived experience. It was a repeated measure design, so we collected the same data again using the same questionnaires. And as you can see, I finished this data collection in 2020. So I'd just like to thank all of my participants, especially if there's any who have joined the meeting today, because this project ran in a time where teachers had to transfer the whole of education to an online experience, and there were a lot of students who didn't have access to the internet, and a lot of students who really struggled to engage with the material. And my participants were kind enough to put their students first and really try to understand what would be happening for autistic people and take part in my research. So I'm very grateful for that. I have 42 participants altogether, and they were mostly from Kent and the southeast of England. There were 41% were teachers, 40 were teaching support staff, and then others included speech and language therapist, industrial liaison officer, HE student services officer, an LRC coordinator, assistant SENCO, a deputy head of additional learning support, and curriculum director. So I was really pleased that so many different staff within education were able to take part in my research. The results of the questions showed that 2 of them, the openness towards autistic students and positive attitudes towards inclusion, although they did increase, they were not statistically significant. And that was because the participants already had very high levels of positive attitudes towards autistic students and inclusion. The training did, however, increase their self-efficacy, and it increased their perceived knowledge. So one of the issues that we had when we transferred the training online was we didn't have the opportunity for discussion, and a lot of the questions relating to actual knowledge were included in the original design to generate discussion, and we weren't able to do that in this project. Just to give an example here, this is the mean scores for the attitudes towards inclusion. The beige bars are a previous study. The blue bars are the level that the participants were at the start of the project before the training, and then the grey bars are after the training. So you can see that they did increase, but it wasn't statistically significant, but they already had higher levels than previous studies. These are the mean scores for the perceived knowledge, and this is where we were hoping to generate discussions about some of the myths and the stereotypes around autism. So you can see that the language here from this questionnaire talks about symptoms and treatment and causes, and these were all elements that we wanted to create discussion around in the original face-to-face training, but weren't able to for this project. However, you can see that still the perceived knowledge around these areas increased as part of the training. A significant aspect was the qualitative data that we collected that really placed value on the lived experience. And that was related to some of the quotes that we used by autistic people. I have one here that we used in the training. It says, "I find it hard to communicate that I'm in pain or something is wrong. Read the symptoms of burnout and why it does not have to be an inevitable outcome. Also encourage differences, not conformity. Physical symptoms like bags under the eyes, yawning in class, always cold, I think is one too. Also withdrawing in class and from friends, becoming quiet and distant, staring into the middle distance, grades suddenly slip or homework isn't handed in on time or up to scratch, getting ill frequently or days off school, crying a lot or red eyes from crying privately, indifference, maybe also short temper or irritable, more likely to get into a fight or an argument." I also would really like you to have a think about this question and maybe enter a response into the chat, so that if there are people here who want to get a greater awareness of what would be supportive for students in school. The question I asked was, what would you say if you could go back and tell your teachers what support you needed? And this is a comment I have from one of the people I asked. I would tell my teachers not to make me for the curriculum, but rather fit the curriculum to me. I'd also tell them that the reason I'm being bullied isn't because I'm socially inept and need to improve my likability, but rather because people are cruel and need to be taught kindness. I think teachers need to actively teach people kindness. And I'm not talking about telling kids how to be nice, but rather showing them and modeling. Finally, some of the limitations for my project were the COVID-19 pandemic meant that I'd chosen questionnaires to generate discussions about stereotypes and myths relating to autism, and I wasn't able to do that in the project. Another limitation was my participants. It meant that I recruited staff that already had high levels of openness towards autistic students and positive attitudes towards inclusion because of their willingness to participate. Despite the project being advertised widely on social media, it was a pandemic, obviously, and the participants that did agree to be part of the research were 100% white. This is representational of the geographic location and demographic of teaching profession in Kent and the southeast of England, but it doesn't really reflect the rest of the country. I would like to finish on another image by Esther. That's Esther holding onto the outside of the box, and a professional sitting in the chair saying, Madam, your autism doesn't fit with my preconceived stereotype. I simply cannot work with you in this way. So can you just please get back in your box? I'd like to say thank you finally to all the autistic people who shared their experiences of education. I'd like to say thank you to Eliza Fricker and Esther Whitney for allowing me to use their images. Also, I'd like to thank all the people who supported me throughout the project, especially my participants and my supervisors. And I would also like to finally mention that the inspiration for me getting a diagnosis, studying a master's in autism studies and completing this project was my daughter, and she has experienced significant difficulties with inclusion in education and sadly continues to experience them. So if there is anything that you can put into the chat that would maybe help other people understand what your experiences were like in education, I'm sure that would be really helpful. Thank you very much. And finally, these are some of my references. These are the measures I used, and those are the references for the measures. Thank you. Turn my video on and stop sharing. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Susie. We'll be having a Q&A session after our next presentation, and I've got a few thoughts myself, but I'll have to hold on to that. We've got our next talk is Shona Murphy, who will be talking about autistic parenting, the pros and cons of autistic parenthood. So over to you, Shona.
Hi, everybody. I'll just share my screen. Right. Hopefully everybody can see that. So my name is Shona Murphy, and I did this research that
It's the wrong view. We've got the presenter's view instead of the slides.
How do we change that, I wonder?
There's a swap.
Sometimes just stopping sharing and trying all over again. Sometimes that does it.
Okay, I'll just stop sharing. Give 1 second, and I'll try and put it in the correct view. There. I'm back.
We can't see it. We can't see it just yet, Shona. There you go. Perfect.
Right, excellent. Okay, so this is my research that I did as part of my master's dissertation at Sheffield Hallam University, where I was looking at the pros and cons of being an autistic parent. And at the time there was almost no research on it, but it's really great. We're starting to see much more research on being an autistic parent at the moment. There's mine was this was published this year, but also there was some by Amanda Dugdale, which was great, Intense Connection and Love, and that was about autistic mothers and their relationships with their children. And then Monique Halser, Duffy and Pedlow, they did about sensory experience as a qualitative study. So I definitely recommend reading those if you're interested in this area. I'm doing my PhD now on false accusations of fabricated and induced illness at Edge Hill University, and that was something that came out of this research. One of the participants was accused of fabricated and induced illness. So I'm just going to adjust my controls are blocking my view. I can't see my slides. So my research questions were: how do autistic parents believe autism impacts parenting? Because like I said, there was almost no research on this topic, but there was, you still did see quite a lot written about assumptions being made about autistic parenting in other research or other papers, and also in just in the media or online, and it was always negative. So people always seem to assume that there was, it was much harder to be a parent when you're autistic. And my personal experience is that some elements are much harder, mainly the sensory side for me. But there were also positives too, which you don't hear being talked about as much. So I was quite sure before I started that I wanted to look at the positives of being an autistic parent and the negatives of being an autistic parent. And I wanted it to actually be autistic parents who are giving their views, because we really aren't heard enough. So I used, because it was a qualitative study, because I wanted to look at people's experiences rather than numbers. So qualitative is the most appropriate in those circumstances. And I wanted to use interviews, but I needed to make sure it was as accessible as possible for autistic people, some of whom might find verbal communication difficult or may have a lot of anxiety. So I offered to do it in whichever form of communication suited the participant, and we ended up, I had 6 participants, 4 I did face-to-face or online interviews because it was before COVID times, and then the other 2 wanted to do it by email. So I had a mixture of kinds of data to analyse, and then I used thematic analysis to bring out the main themes. I also had to think about my positionality, because I'm an autistic parent myself. There were some benefits of that, because I hoped it would be easier for people to talk to me honestly about their experiences and not feel judged, as you often do when you're an autistic parent. I also thought that I had to be aware that I may bring in my own experiences, and I already had preconceived ideas. So I had to be careful when doing the interviews that I wasn't asking leading questions, that sort of thing. So this is what I found. This is my thematic analysis, the main themes. I had 4 main themes, which I'll go into in a bit more detail, but autistic characteristics, relationships, which was a huge one, indirect effect of autism, and stress. And I've broken those down into sub-themes. So if I start to talk through them. Autistic characteristics, I included anything in this that was directly related to autism according to the literature and the diagnostic criteria. And the main things that came through were sensory, that got mentioned a lot, and sensory experiences had both positive and negative impacts. So some of the examples of the negative ones were difficulties tolerating the noise of their children. So one lady said she found it hard to cope with her child's incessant talking. The daughter, another mum was talking about her daughter crying, and she described it as a physical pain, and sometimes she'd be frantic trying to find out the cause and trying to stop it. And she really felt shame at not enjoying the sound of her child laughing, because she's saying it should be like a wonderful thing, but she just found it really stressful. And that sort of feeling of guilt and not feeling like you're doing a good enough job did come through quite a lot in the interviews, actually, which was a shame. All 4 parents, 4 of the 6 parents said they needed time alone, which was something I could relate to. And it's really hard to get when you're a parent. Sometimes you just need a break with everyone being quiet and be on your own, and you just don't get that when they're really small. And from a positive perspective, one of the mums described how she loved the sensory experience of having children, in that she loved their smells, hugs and kisses, which she never got from her own parents. So she described her children as a sensory delight. A couple of quotes. One, Hayley talked about when she would go out and then suddenly have to leave. If I don't know the place beforehand, sometimes I can get there and then we have to leave. And if we have to go shopping, I'm just suddenly freaked out by the coldness of the fridges or the range of choice or colours. I think that must be really difficult for some sometimes if we just have to leave. And also I do have meltdowns. That's something sensory. Sometimes the last straw is a sensory one. So Hayley worried about the effect that was having on her son. But I actually think that it just happened that all of my participants had autistic children, which wasn't like part of the inclusion criteria to be a participant. But I think that sometimes if you've got an autistic child and they can see an autistic meltdown in the parent and how they handle it, I don't think it necessarily always is a bad thing, but it's very stigmatized. So certainly Hayley had a lot of guilt when she had a meltdown in front of her son. And one of the positives from sensory was the empathy side of it. So I recognize that I really need deep pressure when I'm stressed. Light touches drive me insane, but I really crave deep pressure. So I recognize that in my son. That was Sarah. And I do talk about empathy a bit later because that came up a lot. So she said that she was able to support her son better because of her own experiences. Planning and organising was quite a big one in a negative way. And if anything, that's probably the area where I think autistic parents could do with the most support. All 5 of the 6 parents said they were really bad at planning and organising, and that's congruent with more recent research by Paul et al. Research that was happening at the same time as mine. they said that autistic parents are more likely to consider themselves not an organised parent. But even the one lady who said she was hyper organised and really good at being organised, she said there was some negativity there because she said that her father, her husband and their children would get really stressed, saying she was a control freak. Other autistic characteristics included things like demand avoidance that two people mentioned, and in one case it was very serious. So one mum found it hard to feed a baby because she perceived the crying of the baby when he was hungry as a demand, and she said that there was no understanding from the professionals. So she had a lot of input from social services. As the baby was underweight, they had to go back into hospital. So that was a serious negative consequence of demand avoidance. Then we also had some positives in here, like passionate interests. One mum's was childcare, so that's very useful. Learn everything that there is to know about childcare. And what the father, who was a participant, said he was really good at advocating for his son because he is good at objective thinking, which he put down to being autistic. So he would look at the evidence. If a teacher called him into school, he would look at the evidence and decide who he thought, whether he thought he should be telling his son to change behaviour and supporting the teacher, or whether his son was actually in the right and should support his son. So I've already mentioned empathy a little bit, but it was interesting because I never asked specifically about empathy as one of my questions, but every single participant brought it up and they all said that they were better able to empathise with their child, which contrasts with research saying that autistic people have no theory of mind by Baron Cohen. And perhaps it's an example of double empathy because these were all adult autistic parents who had autistic children. Like I said, that wasn't part of my criteria, but it's probably not a coincidence because people who are my age, so like middle-aged, often find out they're autistic because they have an autistic child first, either that or maybe a mental breakdown of some sort. It's quite common for when you meet other autistic parents for them to also have autistic children. So it would be interesting if there were research to see if you'd get that coming through if you had autistic parents of non-autistic children and looked at those relationships. But enhanced empathy is also emphasised by some of the other authors who have researched autistic parenthood. So there was Burton in 2015 did a thesis, came up in that. This is a quote from Max. Another positive thing is that I'm hyper aware of steps and sensory sensitivities. So I'll be really careful with him. I won't invade his personal space and I would never ask him for a hug or anything like that because he hates all that sort of thing. Stress was huge because, which is unsurprising because it's stressful being autistic in a non-autistic world. Generally, autistic people have a lot higher levels of stress. There's loads of research to show that it's stressful being parents of autistic children, as my participants were, because your child has the same levels of stress dealing with the non-autistic world. You have all the things like dealing with schools and their education, and there's just a lot of workload. It's hard. But then also just being a parent is hard because you've got a lot of extra workload, things that you didn't know, new things that you've got to do. So it was unsurprising that that came up for the majority of participants. And like I said, there's plenty of research already about just being a parent to autistic children, even if there's not as much about being an autistic parent. Max said, I think it is the stress, pure stress, just stressing all the time over really ridiculous things. And that is definitely a naughty thing because I've said this to other people and they've said, oh, I'm not even bothered about that. I stress about the future and I have thoughts all the time about things that might go wrong. relationships came up a lot and was quite worrying, particularly the relationships with parents, with professionals. Relationships with the family, it was good to see the relationship with the child was always mentioned positively, which is congruent with the Dugdale research that came out this year. But people had a bit more mixed relationships with their families, so sometimes support from that, like one of the participants talked about support from their parents was enforced support. They didn't have a choice about it, so they took over a bit. Some people had the parents were living too far away to help. So there's a bit mixed there, and the same with other people, relationships with others. So that included other parents. There was quite a bit of mention of the forced social things you have to do as a parent. So having to wait at the school gates and not wanting to talk to people, feeling awkward, or when you have to go to children's parties when they're small and the parents go to. So a lot of these things were mentioned negatively. But it was good to see that once parents were diagnosed with autism or understood they were autistic, there was better understanding. So the two of the people, both of the two people who had social services interventions said there was increased understanding once they knew that they were autistic. And so that was a positive experience for them. But overall, understanding was seen as one of the issues in that parents felt misunderstood by professionals and other people. One of the lady who had the most social services report was struggling with feeding her child. She said that social services could just kept getting the wrong end of the stick. A lot of the comments about when working with professionals were things like people felt scared or anxious. Someone mentioned the aggressive attitude or hostile attitude, professionals not liking being challenged. There was quite a lot of negativity, but there were all six had something negative to say about working with professionals. However, two did have something positive to say, and one of them was the lady who had the most intervention. So she said amongst all of the difficulties she had with social services, there were some really lovely social workers who were really kind and helped her get benefits which she relies on today, even like 10 years later. She's really dependent on the benefits, and also things like helping her get a fridge freezer which she didn't have. So she had a lot of positive support as well as all of the difficulties. And this is consistent with the literature. So Burton's thesis said that they had a theme on discrimination and powerful others. I'll move on quickly to the next one because I don't want to run out of time. Risk of losing child came up for three participants, two because of social services interventions and one because of parenting being judged for a custody battle with an ex-partner. So in this situation, you've got usually non-autistic professionals judging autistic parents, which is a concern because not only was there a lot of talk about misunderstandings, and when you're looking at it from a non-autistic perspective, you might judge things like, for example, they might be looking for emotional warmth, and that can be the non-autistic way. It might be seen as hugs and kisses, but in our house, hugs and kisses would not be a good idea, and that wouldn't be emotional warmth. That would just be causing stress for one of my children. So we do have emotional warmth, but in different ways. And also the assessments that get done are often based on research done on the general population, not on autistic people. So there's a concern there that we don't have appropriate measures and assessments. And this is something that came up with Lily. These are all fake names, by the way, but Lily got accused of fabricated or induced illness. Oh, it was called Munchausen's by proxy syndrome at that time. which is the same except fabricated or induced illness, an expanded version of it. So it includes even more people and you're at higher risk of being accused of it now. But they basically thought she was making up all of her child's issues. In some of her quotes, she said, "It was out of their understanding of how people operate, and my reactions to things weren't how people normally operate. So they knew there was something, and looking back, I can see why they came to the conclusions that they did." She believes now in hindsight that because she was autistic, there was something different about her that they could see, and they didn't know what it was. So they were suspicious, basically, and decided that it was Munchausen's by proxy. Which is sticky. So even after it was proved that she didn't have it, she still said that she thought there were interactions with professionals where she thought they believed it. So that's how I ended up doing my PhD, because since I did that research and I've spoke about it, I hear loads of parents where they're getting accused of FII for various reasons, sometimes misunderstandings, but sometimes it's in response to a complaint. So it almost seems like a silencing tactic. Do we need more research around that? So the main learnings were that a lot of the problems that autistic people face come from stigma and unfair negative judgments around them. There's some sensory things too, and also executive functioning sort of areas where we could do with some support. But diversity of parenting needs to be respected, because at the moment everything's quite normative, and that's why you end up with so many misunderstandings. And autistic people aren't really being heard, so which leads to violations of their human rights, things like FII accusations, and sometimes that can go as far as having children taken away from us unfairly. I've included all my references, so if anybody wants to get in touch with me afterwards, and I can send the presentation on, that's fine. And I think questions will be at the end of will be shortly, I'm not sure when, so feel free to ask questions.
We've got a bit of time before our next presentations for a Q&A. So our next talk is at 15:15. So if we have some questions now, people might fill that time or have a little break or something if need be. We have some questions coming in, and just a couple of comments from myself, couple of really good presentations, and makes me think of somewhat linked after all in a way with education services and navigating them as an autistic parent. And you're both autistic parents of autistic young people, as mine and many people here. So I'm sure people have been relating quite strongly in the chat to both talks. With the first topic, in my own PhD, I looked at educational priorities, and autistic people often came out somewhat differently in their educational ideology to non-autistic parents in my sample. But the autistic parents came out very similarly to the other autistic adults in their views on education. So to Susie, did you see any sort of clashes in ideology between perspectives or groups? Or
I didn't have any interaction with my participants at all, because everything was online, and I had to, the questionnaires were all just links, and then the training was a video, and so, like I did have email exchanges with the people, but no, there wasn't any option for discussions, because I could, it would have been impossible. I was working at home teaching children or young people that didn't have access to to computers. I also had 2 kids at home that were potentially supposed to be homeschooled, and I was trying to do the masters at the same time, so there wasn't any interactions, unfortunately, but I wish that could have been.
Yeah. Question from Jilly to Shona. Were any of the parents in the study single parents?
I didn't specifically ask about that, but there was definitely one, at least, single parent. Yeah.
Interesting dynamics of how people are viewed and judged, and
Yeah,
those comments about intersectional issues in the chat as well around these topics.
Yeah.
And how parents are judged by various professionals and services at times.
So I didn't go into a lot of details about if people had. I just know from knowing who they are that there was at least one single parent, but I don't know about everybody. I didn't ask for that information. But I can see that there's a question from Marjorie as well about my research. So I'm going to put the link in there. I'll do a copy and paste in the link for my research. It was published in GAP. I think it was in March. Good Autism.
Yeah, it'd be good to have the link up in the chat. I posted one that was published earlier this year by Lorna Crane and colleagues, and they found a similar thing about autistic parents and empathy with their children. So this is coming through in different studies now, which is interesting.
It is interesting because it's also, I didn't ask about it specifically either, so that every single person mentioned it. It's obviously, well, it shows that it's important. That people have it on their mind, and I don't know if they have it on their mind partly because of the stereotype that people assume you must be a bad parent because you don't have any empathy. But it's that's the opposite of my experience. Also, not just me personally, but when you go to parenting groups and things and you see other autistic parents, you can see that they're the ones that can tell when a meltdown is coming. And it's also the opposite of what some professionals say. Like when there was a radio interview by Tony Atwood, and he was talking about autistic mums being cold and the child's more likely to run to the autistic father, to the father, the non-autistic father, and it's just not my experience at all, and doesn't come through in research. So it's just stereotypes that have been. So that might be why so many people mentioned it, because they're aware that that's what how people view.
This is because we're seen as unempathetic, lacking theory of mind as a stereotype. You often have to defend that, but it's a very real thing, that empathy with your child and that sharing of autistic ways of being, which are often undermined.
Yeah.
There's comments here from Olatunde about the intersection of racism and ableism. I think it does really need researching and done well. I mean, this area as a whole until recently has been under researched, paper thin, until autistic people started researching it really, and a few others. And I think anecdotally from people I know the problems are very bad out there in practice, and how people are treated is pretty awful sometimes. And I can see a definite.
There's nothing about race in my study, but I know, again, anecdotally, a lot of the difficulties for Black autistic parents and of Black autistic children a lot of it gets seen as challenging behaviour. Or there was one mum I know, they kept saying that her son was in gangs and things, and he wasn't at all. So it's often put down to behaviour rather than autism not recognised. So we do need much more research in that area.
As from some people I know, there's often trouble with like schools involving criminal proceedings and in worst case scenarios pretty awful treatment, and makes me think the fabricated induced illness stuff, if that is amplified, it is sort of double discrimination.
Anecdotally, that's what I've heard as well, that certain families, not just the fact that it's autistic parents necessarily, but certain families more likely to get targeted, and that could be based on race or mental health issues, or
yeah, mental health is another one I've seen used against parents.
Like often personality disorder, which as we know is often an undiagnosed autistic person. So I think Nicki's got a hand up to ask the question.
Yeah, just quickly talk. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Shona. Such an interesting presentation. Talking about working with people from Black, Asian, minority and ethnic communities. I've just put a link in the chat. We do a lot of work with an organisation called Autism Voice based in Lambeth, which was set up by families and BAME communities affected by autism, and they're contributing to our research. And I put the link in the chat for anybody who would want to connect with that group particularly, because they're actually very proactive, but really underrepresented in research. You know, it's incredibly important. And they talk a lot about things like stigma and feeling distrustful of some of the professionals with whom they're in contact, which is not unusual. It's somewhere in the chat, but I'll post it again if you want, because I can see you're looking for it, Shona.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
There's a question there about strategies autistic parents can use to avoid maltreatment by professionals.
I would say, in terms of the FAI part, getting accused of things, you can keep evidence, keep emails, be organised, keep letters. You can record conversations. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to be giving legal advice, but I do believe it's allowed to record for personal use. So if you need a record for yourself, you can, without somebody knowing. Take somebody with you who is more likely, so that there's a witness, and also if they're not taking you seriously, sometimes it can help to have, whether it's an advocate or a friend. It's a tricky one, because if you've got FAI, has been mentioned already, as soon as that happens, then it all gets looked at through that lens, the lens of you being a liar or over anxious, and it silences people. It also makes them scared to speak out, because I've actually seen just recently an example where they were actually quite blatant. They said if the mum carries on with the complaint, then they're going to report them to social services. So basically that's a threat. If they really thought there was a reason for why they should be referred to social services, they should be doing it anyway. It shouldn't depend on whether they put a complaint in. So I think it is getting used as a tactic sometimes to silence people.
I mean, part of the reason I've gotten so qualified in autism was to safeguard my son's interest. If you can show you, I wouldn't advise that to everyone to get sort of master's degrees and whatnot, is a bit of an effort, but it has certainly helped me having a status of I'm a senior lecturer at Tis Art Centre when dealing with services in Kent. It's had some serious battles in even with that, it doesn't defend against these kinds of accusations.
It's actually
you need, sorry, I was just going to say, you need support systems. So over the years, I've had people from the NAS, University of Kent, Studio 3. I've used every network I've had at times in order to bring people in when necessary to fight your viewpoint and point of view. Because sometimes professionals have gotten things so badly wrong, it's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
And even with all that support, we still had major issues.
Yeah.
So that's what we're up against here.
One of the hard things for FAA is everything that you think used to defend yourself can get used against you. So actually being knowledgeable on the subject is seen as inappropriate, because like, you're not supposed to argue with the doctors. And they have this list of characteristics of the parents, and within that, it's that they have a lot of medical knowledge. So nurses are likely to be accused. Plus also the way autistic people communicate, we sometimes info dump. We're really good at researching. We do get a lot of knowledge on something we're interested in, and clearly that's anything that's affecting your children. So we're almost more likely to be highlighted for FAI just because of the knowledge. So another bit of advice would be, which I think I got from the Fight Back website, if you're going to...
Should say we're running over time, so we better end things and leave things to the chat box, because we have our next presenter to introduce. Sorry it's a bit of a tight schedule today.
People can email me if they have any more questions, or on my Edgehill email address, murphysh@edgehill.ac.uk.
So we have our next speaker is Lynnae Buffel. Whose work in this area has been really important, I think, and only recently been published, but maybe that speaks to the topic. I'll leave that to Lynnae to explain. So over to you, Lynnae.
Thanks, Damian. Yeah, it's a shame we didn't have more time over the previous one. I do think that's a very important topic. As an autistic parent of 5 kids, I've been interested in this. So I'm going to talk about my research about autistic inertia, but I'm not just doing a report of my research this time. Quite a lot of you will have already seen or heard of it, and I thought I'd do a specifically PARC-oriented twist on it, and look at the implications of understanding autistic inertia for autistic traits in general and how we see them. So first I'll talk about autistic characteristics specifically, and how inertia fits with them, and then about some broader issues. This is a very quick overview of what I've done. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manchester. I do some independent consulting as well with various projects in various universities. I'm not a social science researcher. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, so please give me a break. I'm a bit nervous about this audience more than any others that I've had recently. I'm studying autistic inertia because of very strong encouragement from other autistic people. Basically, they said, somebody's got to do this, and we can't find anybody else, so you better do it. It's also ruining my life, so I have quite intense lived experience. I did focus groups, 4 of them in person at Autscape, which hopefully most of you know about. Autscape is a big autistic event run every year for the last 17 years or so. I've been involved since the start. And I did some focus groups online in text chat. I chose text because it has various advantages that I have written about on my lab's website. So rather than having like a Zoom discussion, we did it in text. And because this went through ethics pre-pandemic, it was actually really difficult to get them to approve this at all. It would now be a lot easier. And I did thematic analysis. Autistic characteristics and inertia. So first I'll talk about what inertia is in case you've never heard of it. So this is autistic tendencies to stay on one path and to have difficulty stopping, starting, or changing. So the overriding thing is a tendency to maintain one state. So the quotes in the bubbles are from my participants. So for example, this one says, I will decide that I should stop and I want to stop and I'm not enjoying what I'm doing, and then continue to do it for quite a while. And difficulty finding the first step. So it's difficult to separate the blob of lots to do into small, potentially doable bits. And a disconnection between intention and action. So it's like I withdraw into myself and then watching myself from another place until the body is stuck. And lack of voluntary control. So it's not something that we can just stop having. I can't overcome my inertia. I have to wait for it to go away. So I'll go into each of these in some more detail. The reason that we started calling it inertia is from physics. It's not from being inert and not being able to, not doing anything like an inert gas, but rather from an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and an object at rest tends to stay at rest unless something external acts on it. So this means an uninterrupted activity is too easy to continue. So some more detail about this and how it fits with autism. The traditional view of autistic traits are that we have a resistance to change, perhaps intolerance of uncertainty. That's one of the newer views of it. Difficulty with transitions, repetitiveness, possibly they think due to lack of imagination. And autistic people say repetitiveness is soothing. And when you have a need for planning, warning, and preparation. And my research says that we have a difficulty with all kinds of stopping, starting, or changing. And that something that's uninterrupted is easy to continue. But you can use this to your advantage as well, to reduce interruptions if you want to continue something, or create interruptions if you want to stop. My participants said that often any sort of barrier was insurmountable. So that might be a barrier that's physical. So there's something in the way, like wanting to put something in the washer, but can't put something in the washer because there's something in front of the washer and they would have to move it. And the moving it is a whole separate task from the putting things in. So that ends up being impossible to do. And they get stuck in loops. So getting stuck doing the same thing over and over again, or a certain sequence of things. And sometimes this level of stuckness feels physical. But they also have difficulties with barriers that are procedural, so having to do something before something else, and this can also lead to the loops of not being able to work out where to start. And but this tendency to stay in one state can be an asset if you're focusing on something that you want to. So this is this is one of autism's greatest strengths. If you can harness it and focus and not end up stuck doing things that you don't want to do, then it's pretty awesome. So sometimes people get stuck on things that they don't want to, but if we can organize things so that it's not interfering, then it can be very helpful. So some people had difficulty finding the first step. Most of my participants had this sort of difficulty. A traditional view of this is to look at it as executive dysfunction. Some of us might be calling it executive dysfunction. Some theories of autism put EF or EF deficits, as they would say it, right at the core of autism. These sorts of theories have difficulty explaining some aspects of autism, like sensory issues. Executive dysfunction also causes difficulty planning and organizing. So this idea that autistic people have perfect routines and perfectly tidy spaces, I've heard about this, but I've never met anybody who's actually like that. Autistic people say that they're often late and disorganized and they have trouble completing tasks. So this is how it fits, how my research fits into this traditional view of an autistic trait. Many people said they had difficulty breaking a task down, but even more said that they broke tasks down into too many pieces. So instead of having this blob of lots to do, like in this quote, they have a pile of millions of tiny pieces, and it's impossible to work out which one comes first. And they can also end up making a task so complex and circular that you can't tell which thing to do first because everything depends on everything else. And difficulty working out which one of those things should win. So I think this is a particularly autistic approach to having difficulty breaking down tasks, is actually breaking it down far too much. And whatever kind of problem they had with this planning and organizing, they all had difficulty finding the first step. So I tend not to talk about executive function. There are a few reasons for this. I find that the whole notion of executive function is very woolly and very broad. It's basically whatever your frontal lobes do. And too many things fit into it, and there's not enough agreement on what is and what isn't executive function. Also, pretty much anything that is different about a brain will cause differences or issues with executive function. So it's not very specific to autism. So instead, I talk about difficulty finding the first step or difficulties with planning, because that's more precise. And so almost everyone had that sort of difficulty working out where to start, but a few people also have a more basic difficulty with engaging with what they want to do and turning their intentions into actions. And so there's this disconnection. One person said, it's like I withdraw into myself, then watching myself from another place, and so the body's stuck. There's quite a bit about that. So this fits with traditional or old-fashioned views about autism, as autistic children are in their own world, or not engaged, not connected. There's that rather negative view of the autistic child as kidnapped and locked away. And some people put a positive spin on it and see the children as especially spiritual. Autistic people say sometimes that they feel like they're behind glass or behind a wall or otherwise behind some sort of barrier from other people. This is also sometimes what non-autistic people say, but autistic people have said this too. And there's some documentation that some autistic people have a lack of control over their movements. That's what these little references are in the bottom. One study looked at the memoirs of 3 non-speaking autistic young people, and all of them related difficulties controlling their movements so that they would move in ways that they didn't want to or not be able to move in ways they did want to. But one of my favorite ones that's really not got any attention at all, probably because it's a single case study, where they looked at a young woman who was considered to have pretty serious behavior problems and non-compliance. And they looked at the sort of indications of effort in her brain versus actual effort in squeezing a hand grip that she was asked to do. And they could see that there were changes in her brain and in various things that they were testing, like her galvanic skin response, I think. When she was asked to do it, there were indications that she was trying, but there was no actual squeezing of the grip. So it may have been all along that she was always trying to comply and was being given behavioral interventions and all sorts of things she couldn't control. So in my inertia research, this is my main interest, but I haven't worked out a good way of separating this from more general problems doing things yet. Many people described a lack of connection between their thoughts and feelings, intentions and actions. So being stuck, unable to move, wanting to do something and not being able to do it. Switched off or powered down, so being completely unaware, including for quite long periods, up to a few hours, and a general sort of not caring about the time that had passed. Observing themselves failing to act and not particularly minding about that. And altered time perception. So unlike executive function type problems, this can happen even with really simple tasks, like lying down in bed when already sitting on the bed, or picking up a book that's sitting right next to you. For me, I've had difficulty picking up a remote control while on the TV was something I really didn't want to watch. So some autistic people have these sorts of problems, and most have the executive function type. And overall, it's really important to realize that it's not something that we can control on purpose. So the traditional view would be that autistic people are often non-compliant, and that this non-compliance is behavioral, and it's demand avoidance or pathological demand avoidance, or that it's controlling behavior that's driven by anxiety, which is part of PDA. I'm not saying that I believe in PDA or think it's a good thing. Lack of desire to meet social expectations, so they think everything we do is social, or that we have a low frustration tolerance, so we won't even try. My research suggests that inertia is unpredictable, variable, and not something that we can control. It affects activities that are also complex or aversive, but also things that are easy, fun, familiar, that we want to do. So it's not laziness. It's not avoiding doing something that's horrible. It can apply to meeting basic needs and performing simple actions. Conscious will and efforts just don't work. But rather than putting a lot of effort in and being unable to do something, most people said that they just weren't able to even try to do it. It's like they have difficulty working out, creating an intention. So no talk about autistic traits would be complete without a discussion about social stuff. So they think that we're lacking social motivation. This is based on the aloneness. It's often used as a measure of effectiveness, is the ability to initiate social interactions. So that statement's not very clear on its own, but I mean, they often use the number of initiations of social interaction as a measure of how well their intervention has worked. And my research says that the most important deficit, the most important difficulty that was created by Inertia was their difficulty maintaining relationships. They really wanted relationships. They're having trouble keeping them up because people need them to initiate. Some people didn't appreciate that they were expected to, that they weren't keeping up. So a friend who wouldn't like, who thinks that you don't care because of lack of initiation. And also, contrary to popular beliefs about autism, most people found that other people were far and away the most helpful intervention. So the thing that helped them to go the most was having someone else around doing something compatible. The thing that made things worst was something that's flexible and only for themselves and not needed by anything external. So activity, especially human activity, makes a huge difference. So some broader issues, just briefly. Is inertia specific to autism? I've been calling it autistic inertia, but is it? There are at least 38 different terms for difficulty initiating voluntary action. This leads to fragmented research. So I recently found another one that I didn't even, a friend had this diagnosis years ago, but I didn't know. Anyway, it's obsessional slowness, in case anyone wonders. But I have a list of these. I think they're on my website and my blog. So I've found from the literature, from looking at all these things, and from my own research, that there's a sort of inertia triad. These three things tend to go together: difficulties with motor control, difficulties with executive function, and something they often call apathy, but that's really trouble with initiating goal-directed actions. This is also seen in Parkinson's, depression, schizophrenia, and to some extent in ADHD. So no, it's not autism specific. Is it part of autism? It's impossible to say at this point what's essential and what's optional in being autistic. Similar to sensory issues and executive function, I think that difficulties doing things are common, but not universal. Elements of inertia have been used in grand unified theories of autism, like the one that bases it all on executive function. It's a very disabling aspect of autism for some people. There are other things that it might be related to, including one that I saw a flash past on the chat, which I've tried to push off my screen so it's not distracting. Catatonia. So this is a movement disorder characterized by freezing and trouble with intentional movements. Anxiety, conflicting reports on the role of anxiety and whether anxiety is really tied in with inertia and catatonia and lots of other things. Fatigue. Lots of people talked about fatigue. It's a bit of a vicious circle because being tired makes it harder to overcome the inertia barrier, and the effort of doing so makes you tired. Stress and burnout. So it appears that these problems are triggered or made worse by stress. Where this fits with shutdown and getting completely frozen and switched off. Where it fits with monotropism, which I think there's a huge amount of overlap, but it doesn't quite cover it. And demand avoidance and non-compliance. So definitely some sort of relationship with demand avoidance, but we don't have a perfect overlap there either, because some people like me actually do much better when told what to do. So I'm kind of the opposite of demand avoidance. I'm like prompt dependent. Where it fits with adverse experiences or trauma, that goes back to stress, and how it fits with dissociation, especially depersonalization. So I don't have a lot of time to do this. Rigid and repetitive behavior is related to the tendency to maintain one state. Executive dysfunction is related to difficulty finding the first step. Being in their own world is related to disconnection between intention and action. Non-compliance and the lack of voluntary control. So inertia might be a part of many autistic characteristics, needs more recognition and a lot more research. And if this affects you, then get Amita Shah's book and look at my website. And I think I can make the slides available. And on to the next person.
Thank you very much, Lynnae. Just to let you all know that the next session will not be recorded, so that will not feature in the recording. Damian, I'll hand over to you to introduce that session.
Thanks, Neil.
Perfect. So if you have any questions for our previous two speakers, so Lynnae and Sophia have joined us on screen with Damian, please do pop your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we'll work our way through them. Any questions at all can pop in there. You can upvote on the questions you most want answered by clicking the thumbs up symbol. Damian, I'll hand over to you to get us started.
Thanks both. Really interesting talks, and ones I personally related to quite strongly. And there was just a comment in the chat, which I think is quite interesting just now. We could comment on the potential impact on schema development. So sort of having like a schema they have an example of going to the pub, so it's less and it's predictability, and it kind of links in with predictive coding theory, I thought, as well, looking into that. And this issue of prediction and how we're perceiving the world and how this all sort of links together. So I'm not sure if you've got anything to say about schemas or prediction, Sophia, or elaborate on those.
I think for like the non-autistic people in my life, when they go somewhere, as long as that place is generally the same as it was the time before, then they don't notice that anything's changed. But for me, every time I go somewhere, even if that place is familiar, it doesn't matter how small the change is, that place has now become unpredictable. So it's really hard for me to have a set idea of what a place will be like, because I notice all the small changes that other people just seem to ignore.
I mean, I've commented anecdotally on this stuff many a time with me and my son, because there's this stereotype around lacking generalization skills, and to me, especially for my son, it's every situation is a brand new situation. He just doesn't generalize. He's very, very specific. Every new instance is a new instance. And it's really breaking things down minutely on noticing the tiniest differences. And it's kind of, to me, non-autistic people have always had a kind of strong draw to see sameness, consensus, similarity, agreement. And I'm always there going, but hang on a minute, you're missing this, and it. It's kind of, so what you're saying really resonates with me. So I think it's really interesting work, and especially getting autistic and non-autistic people in your second study to judge the similarity. I think that would be really interesting, and you'll get quite different results there, I predict. There's been a few questions coming through in the Q&A, some about the Lynnae's talk. Quite a big one. Interested to hear the link between burnout and PDA and inertia. A couple of questions there, really.
Yeah, we don't really know yet what connection there might be. We do know that catatonia, which is almost certainly related to at least some aspects of inertia, is often triggered by something really stressful. But I think that's usually more in the moment, whereas burnout is really prolonged stress. But it wouldn't, I know anecdotally that, although it's all anecdotal, really qualitative stuff, but I know that some people, part of their being burnt out is for their inertia to be like 100 times worse and totally out of control, and not like something that can manage.
I think
I don't
there's
know where
kind of
PDA fits.
looping things that potentially. So I was thinking that the social factors, like having overwhelmed, too many social pressures, expectations, will add to the potential stress and anxiety factors. And then if you're getting that inertia, might be worse when the pressure's worse. And it could lead to collapse, crisis, burnout, different kinds of responses. And with demand avoidance, I've always thought there's elements of stress and stress response one has to take into account, as well as autistic ways of being or other factors. But inertia seems to be very linked to what the PDA community have talked about in recent years, what they call the internal demand, so not being able to do what one wants to do. And things like that seems to link quite strongly with some of the stuff you've talked about on inertia. So I think there are links to look at there.
Having talked to one person who identifies as having quite significant PDA and very obviously has inertia, catatonia type problems, I think for her, it's that, well, I think for many of us, a stress will cause freezing. And for her, any sort of demand whatsoever is just incredibly stressful and is the thing that triggers her to freeze. And so I think some people are more sensitive than others to demand, external or internal. And that is the stress that causes them to freeze if they're prone to freezing.
So another comment was, it's often confused, I think, with symptoms of depression. So lack of motivation is often linked with depression. So that's often read into how someone's behaving or acting. And often
Yeah.
it's not a lack of motivation at all.
No, it's not a lack of motivation. You can be very highly motivated and wanting to do the thing and not even depressed. And it happens. And depression takes away motivation, which of course will make inertia worse because there's a huge amount of overlap in what it actually looks like in the sort of things that it affects, but they're not the same thing. But yeah, people get those confused a lot. But yeah, not if you have both, then you know the difference. But not being able to get out of bed because life is too hard and moving is too hard because you're depressed is quite different from wanting to and just not being able to act.
I think the comments in the chat earlier about, in your presentation, about prompt dependency versus demand avoidance is interesting. So I don't like being prompted or told what to do. I'm a bit demand avoidant myself. But I do get inertia type problems in getting started with things and get overwhelmed. But someone telling me to start doing it will probably make the situation worse rather than better for me. So it's interesting how all these dynamics play out different people.
It's what one of my children calls their anti-authoritarian goblin.
I've got one of those.
Better not tell them to do something because if you do, you've just ruined it. Now it's impossible. I've got a two like that.
I can relate to that. And there is a comment as well about the links with flow. So are they opposites, inertia and flow?
I think they tap into the same underlying thing, but you're the expert on flow. I have I think flow is basically inertia that you want.
Good way of looking at it. It's sort of a track here. It's a positive, feels good to be on in a way.
Yeah, well, a tendency to continue what you're doing and to be completely immersed, and everybody can do it, even NTs, but it's something that autistics are particularly good at or prone to. But I think if it can be used for good or ill.
Definitely. There's a question for Sophia, quite a tricky one. Have you done anything to compare differences in real-world spatial situations versus differences on screen? Lots of autistic people are hypermobile, and hypermobility is associated with size differences in the brain area that deals with body position in space, which may contribute to anxiety. Didn't know that. Hypermobility linked with proprioception.
We had hoped to do some real life hypersensitivity to different tasks, but since the COVID situation, none of that's been possible. So it's all had to be done on screen. But hopefully it's something that we'll be able to do in the future.
Yeah. Would be good to continue this work into the future, and hopefully, I mean, COVID's hit a lot of these projects pretty badly, but there's a lot of scope, I think, with these issues to continue in that area. There's a comment here. I find changes in my partner's habits and behaviours very stressful and anxiety provoking, like suddenly starting humming, which he never did before. So is that it's kind of prediction thing, and you get used to habits, I guess. And so differences that appear out of nowhere can be unsettling. I guess it links to both talks in a sense. That, we've got a few more minutes, but we're heading towards the comfort break. There's a question, what do we know about the differences between inertia difficulties and depression motivation problems? How could you tell them apart, I guess?
What do we know is nothing, because my one study is the only thing that's been done on inertia itself so far, and while catatonia is related, it's a lot more pronounced, so it's easier to tell that isn't just a lack of motivation, although people who get very depressed also get catatonic, so there's that. But yeah, so we don't know yet, but I just think that you can feel the difference, but that's not very helpful at all. Yeah, so it's just a difference between really wanting to do something and not being able to do it, or having difficulty even wanting to, but that's not really it.
There's a comment in the chat here which relates to noticing differences from my time. My son saw the difference between so-called identical chairs at nursery at age 2. He considered one of them his chair.
Yeah, I remember him going, "Where's my chair? Where's my chair?" And but that's all he could say. And they were like, "Here's your chair." No, where's my chair? That's all I could say.
I think some similarities in family traits there.
Yeah, well, the whole family now
With this
knows not to sit in my chair.
hypersensitivity to changes in environment, explain why children might find it harder to enter classrooms at school. Well, apart from the general overwhelm and overload, I would say yes, but Sophia, would you agree with that around busy classrooms and changes in environment?
That was always one of the hardest things for me at school, was knowing that even though the environment seemed the same to everybody else, it wouldn't be exactly the same as the last time I was there. And schools generally just have far too much sensory information.
They are generally overloading, chaotic places, and sometimes very loud, unpredictable noises, smells, and whatnot's coming from all directions. And to me, it's little wonder, really, that people struggle in school environments, especially the really big, busy ones.
And all of that causes meltdowns in some people, and it causes others to get stuck. So there's actually a relationship between that. My worst or most pronounced episodes of being completely stuck and incapable have been in airports, because they're like primary school classrooms.
I had a nasty experience recently. I was in Denmark and found out in the airport trying to get home that the documents to get back into the UK were completely different to the ones needed to go to Denmark. So, and I had to do an online form, get a new test done in the airport, ended up missing my flight, having a mild panic attack in the airport, and then having to book another hotel for the night and a flight the next day, and it was yeah, airports was
Awful.
a lot of fun, but in COVID times, until this is all different, I'm not sure I'm going to be traveling abroad for a while.
Just stay home.
Yeah. So I think we should probably go to break there. There's loads and loads of messages in the chat, so I'll have a read through some of those, pick up on some of them. But we've got a short 15-minute comfort break until our next session. So do what you need to do, grab a cup of tea or whatever, and we'll see you soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Damien. We'll see you all shortly. Damien, over to you.
Thanks, Neil. So we're on to our next session now, and I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Daniel Lovesy, on I am an autistic researcher, not autism researcher, non-standardized approaches in a standardized world. So linked strongly to the PARC ethos, no doubt. A nice title there. So over to you, Daniel.
Lovely, thank you. So yes, so this is a talk about a kind of almost like a side project from my main PhD thesis. So, and it's about my own positionality and all the experiences of me and how it feeds into my research. So it's more of a sort of an overview of the methodological and philosophical discussions stroke existential crisis that I've had whilst I'm doing my PhD. And I'll explain a bit more about where I am up to in my PhD in a little while. But my actual PhD thesis is related to, is actually titled The Precariat is a Good Name for a Rock Band. And it's actually looking at the transition of autistic students into the world of creative industries, and in particular with a focus on the gig economy, part-time hourly paid work, and the realities of what is a really competitive and difficult sort of industry to get into. This talk, what I'm going to talk about now, is really related about the philosophical questions as I was trying to design a methodology that would incorporate and allow participatory, emancipatory approaches into the research process. So it's essentially me talking about some of the challenges and some of the ideas that I have come across over the past 3 years. So a bit of background about me. I'm a third-year PhD student at Bishop Grose University in Lincoln. Prior to sort of working in academia, in higher education, my background was learning support, academic support, and I've worked through a variety of different institutions, from specialist colleges for adults with learning difficulties, a short stint in a primary school, and then more recently further education and now higher education, apart from a 2-year holiday when I worked in accessibility in sport. But this talk and my PhD is really just an amalgamation of the different steps I've taken to get to where I am now. And the first point I started thinking about was sort of where do I fit in this process, this research, this huge area of PhD investigation. And one of the earliest conversations I had with my mentors and supervisors was about my own positionality, that as an autistic adult, as an autistic academic, musician, father, friend, and Dan, that all of these elements were something that I wanted to incorporate into my research, and actually my own positionality allowed me the luxury and opportunity to not only connect with the experiences of other autistic people, but also allow me to explore and understand how I see the world and how others see the world, and try and see how we can kind of align that disconnect. So when I started looking at the who is I, and I'm not going to go into a deep dive into Descartes, this is the more immediate self-reflection that I started as I started the process of research and positionality. So I was thinking about myself as an academic, where I want to be and how I see myself, but also how historically the narratives around autistic academics, how autism has been researched, understood and shared. Also looking at the musician side to me. So something I'm really sort of find is a huge part of my expression is how I produce music and create music. And all of these aspects of me had positives and negatives that were influenced and in some ways defined by my autism. So in terms of academic and my sort of professional work, I can be very focused. I've got I'm very proud of the fact that I'm able to recall huge amounts of information about modules, about assessments, about examinations, about essays and all this kind of stuff. I also like the fact that I'm creative and I can think outside the box. So in my day-to-day role, I've got a big fascination with creating accessible assessments, taking what is a kind of standardized assessment and then looking at how we can make it inclusive and accessible. On the flip side, there's the sort of less positive aspects of me. So the fact that I can get excited about marking, become quite obsessive and sidetracked by quite minutiae detail in policies, academic regulations. As a musician, I highlighted that my autism allowed me the ability to focus, create and communicate some amazing sort of ideas and concepts that I wouldn't normally probably be able to kind of verbalize. But then I kind of found I was more interested in the process of creating rather than the end product. So I've got hundreds of unfinished songs that probably will never get finished because I just enjoy making. Something that resonated earlier was my own position as a father, that I like to think of myself as a loving father, but a constant worrier. The first year of my son's life was just spent in a constant state of worrying about colds, norovirus, sickness and diarrhea. And it was something I wasn't able to turn off. So like I had that kind of instant connection and sort of empathetic connection with my son. In lots of ways, I was overly sensitive, overly empathetic. A friend, I consider myself emotionally intelligent, quirky, but the quirkiness can become annoying. And the emotional intelligence, although very applicable to other people, when I'm trying to reflect on myself, I can kind of come across as a social worrier, not warrior. So I often have to kind of have people spot check me on nights out and work events because I'm so worried about doing or saying something embarrassing. So the above, all of these are kind of direct experiences that shape my worldview. And when developing my methodology, I was keen to look at a process that would allow me to collect experiences, share wisdom and knowledge, and also the challenges of autistic life. I also wanted to look at how I could challenge kind of standard and sort of more traditional views of research. And my starting point was to kind of look at a methodological tool that I could kind of start to shape and create and adapt and include participatory, emancipatory, and democratic principles of research. And I'll kind of go on to talk about the starting point, but essentially I was looking at a phenomenological approach that would allow this. So I wanted to move away from the idea of collated group thoughts to lived experiences, common knowledge, common thoughts and ideas and themes. Each of these components and others are things that I feel add to my research and approaches from both an interpersonal perspective, but also the ability to create ideas, share them, and disseminate information to people. So increasingly, so I slight glitch with my slide. So apologies about this. I'm not sure what's happening to my controls. Okay, so the starting point was thinking about where I fit into this research. And I came across the idea that there was no I in research, but there is in participatory, emancipatory, and democratic. And the idea that underpinned all of these was the idea that I wanted to question whose story is it to tell. Historically, the sort of narratives around autism research has been driven by scientific, clinical, psychological perspectives. This can often and has created ideas of deficits, and in my own relationship with my autism can be seen about things I can't do, impairments. I wanted to move away from this idea, but likewise, I was also conscious that there are often perspectives and narratives that are the other way. The idea of sort of superpower, superhumans. And actually, I wanted to kind of position myself somewhere in between, that there are areas of life that I struggle with because of my autism. Likewise, there are areas of my life that I feel I'm really good at my job, for instance, and being a father because of my autism. But the reality is I wanted to kind of sit somewhere between the two ends. So my approach was kind of looking at how my autism is something that on the day-to-day basis invariably does help me. My ability to call information and think outside the box and to think creatively is something that I'm sort of immensely proud of, and it's something that I'm openly talk about as being part of my autism. There are parts of my life that can be difficult, and I think like the constant state of worry and anxiety is part of that. However, one of the things I'm very open with the students I work with, who I'm colleagues who know I'm autistic, is that the move to being open for me wasn't about kind of making it all about me. It's about identifying and opening up the discussion of what autism is and what autism can be, which is where I'm currently kind of sitting. But I'm also aware that my journey is my own, and whilst others may not be as far down the line in terms of disclosing and talking openly about their autism, one of the things that I wanted to kind of feed into my research was the student and the sort of individual experience to help shape and develop the assessments and the research processes. So again, apologies about the slides. I'm not sure what's going on here. So my starting point was looking at positivism. So I wanted to kind of automatically, when I started the research process, move away from positivism. And I was going to actually start this slide with a joke about why did the positivists cross the road? But when I started writing it, it just started coming across like some kind of autism assessment paperwork questionnaire kind of thing. So as I was designing the research process, I wanted to move away from historical approaches. I became fascinated by the research and the design of research and how we can acknowledge the historical narratives of positivism, but also move away from this to kind of create something different. In my view, lots of these historical approaches have kind of created stereotypes of what autism is, not what it can be. I also wanted to kind of move away from the homogeneous idea of a group, because I wanted to kind of look at a collection of experiences and understandings and ideas. I also wanted to kind of look at how we can kind of diversify the autistic voice. And one of the questions that I kind of came across quite early on in my research was, who decides who is autistic? How can we move away from the kind of the diagnostic tool? So in my own research, I use self-identification as a valid form. I recognize the barriers that people face when seeking diagnosis and support for autism. I also identify and acknowledge that I was very lucky that one very good relationship with a GP was the thing that triggered the whole process of me getting my diagnosis and my resolution. But I also wanted to kind of look at the idea that there are, that as a autistic researcher, that I'm not a gatekeeper. So as well as having self-identification on the basis that the path to diagnosis, formal diagnosis, can be difficult and challenging, is underpinned by clinical, scientific, and arguably deficit ideas, that actually as an autistic person, I'm conscious that I don't want to be an autistic gatekeeper of who of saying someone's autistic or not autistic. I want it to be a very person-centered approach. And that kind of leads into the final point about who decides who is autism. And that's a deliberate play on words, because I wanted it to reflect the community, that actually the community isn't a collection of statistics, isn't a collection of, is actually a collection of experiences, a collection of people. So, so this was a kind of the second sort of point I sort of kind of came across, which is when I was diagnosed as autistic at the age of 35. Historically, I'd worked in specialist colleges, and actually one of the sort of things that started me on the road to kind of self-identification, and ultimately I was fortunate to get the diagnosis, was about understanding what autism isn't. It's about moving away from stereotypes around autism and the sort of triad of impairments. And I was starting this process when I was reflecting on my own methodology for my PhD. Was I kind of came quite fascinated by the idea that autism is one of a few specific conditions or specific ideas that has degrees, has the opportunity to study in depth. I kind of started thinking about this idea of what is so special about autism. So why do we have these courses? And I think one of the things that I really like is that the fact it raises awareness, and increasingly initiatives like PARC and the work of Luke Bearden has created this idea that actually autistic people are at the forefront and at the center now of shaping new narratives about autism, moving away from sort of like almost a commercialization of autism, where historically non-autistic companies, entities, people could create their own narrative and could shape what they feel autism is. And actually, by moving to these new narratives, we can kind of start to question what autistic culture is, and actually how we can diversify that voice and diversify that culture. So going into voice, one of the things that I kind of really sort of wanted to include in my own research was that there is no one autistic voice, and there's no one autistic experience. I'm an expert on my own autistic voice. I'm an expert on my own autistic experience. And as I've started talking to autistic colleagues, autistic people, and as I've started kind of really sort of throwing myself into the world of autistic research, one of the things that I've kind of come across is that lots of barriers to diagnosis or identification of autism have often come down to stereotypes. So how autism can present in female identifying autistic people can be totally different to how it presents in me. I also wanted to kind of look at how we can kind of generate moving away from one autistic experience, And then linking into the sort of the work of double empathy, hermeneutics, as well as part of my own interpretive phenomenological analysis approach, is looking at how can we ever truly capture other people's autistic experience? Can we ever actually truly understand it and disseminate it? And that was one of the central challenges about my research design, was how we can bring all of these kind of ideas together. And the metaphor I came up with was almost was the idea of playing tennis with snooker cues. Was that in their own right, they are two very distinct, very clear and key ideas, but when we try and put them together, that's where the mismatch occurs. So moving on to the idea of identity, I wanted to kind of really focus on the idea that we are experts in our own autism and our own lived experience. And I kind of started seeing myself and my role within the research is actually towards more of a facilitator of voice, identity, and experience. And actually, as a person who's collecting these ideas and trying to understand and create my own meanings, that actually what I really wanted to do was be able to facilitate and share these ideas and commonalities. And this kind of has created another side interest for me, actually, which is increasingly the discussion around autism for me professionally is actually the idea that training that I'm going to be doing for sort of staff at my workplace, which is going to be designed with students who are and autistic students especially, is actually should the discussion be not about what autism is or necessarily what autism can be, but actually what it isn't. So what it is not, because actually lots of these stereotypes and ideas and perceptions of autism have become very sort of skewed. And actually, as we start to diversify the autistic voice, the different views and ideas are hugely kind of different. With this in mind, I started kind of developing my own methodological frameworks. This is kind of one of the areas that I'm really sort of fascinated and almost obsessive about at the moment, is in creating a sort of an approach that will allow full participation at all stages, from research design, understanding, sort of research design, carrying out of research, the understanding, analysis, and also dissemination. And my starting point for this was IPA, and I really like the idea of considerations of double empathy, hermeneutics, and the analysis part to kind of try and create something new, something different. So this was kind of like including the participatory approaches in the design and creation of research methods, the interpretation and analysis of events, the collation and sharing of ideas, the mutual search for common meanings and ideas, collaborative dissemination across multiple platforms of media, participants being able to contribute and choose how they want their ideas shared. I summarize this kind of like method, sort of this concept really in sort of a early conceptual model that I did. This related to the sort of round peg square hole idea, and how, although this relates specifically into employment, but how a lot of the things we try and enforce are actually rather than bringing the autistic individual into the kind of my concept and my world, I wanted to kind of see if we could do it the other way around, or do it kind of in a mutual kind of way. So potential barriers. So one of the things that I've kind of struggled across with these new ideas and these kind of including these participatory approaches is actually the ethical review process. So PARC creates some amazing kind of opportunities and networking and discussion points. And one of the areas I've kind of started looking at is how is, although the participatory aspect from my field and my perspective is there, the review processes can still be very difficult, both as an autistic researcher, but also as a researcher who wants to get the autistic voice in there. But I've also looked at how methodologies and methods are taught and discussed, the literature we share. Now, actually, as someone who wants to enter the world of academia and academic journals, the processes of getting, of accessing those. So the future, collections of experiences and commonalities, not trends or patterns. Looking at how we diversify the autistic voice. And when I say voice, I mean communication in all forms. That actually, I'm in a privileged position that I have a platform for my voice, but how do we go and get the voice of all members of the autistic community? Those with additional profound, multiple, complex learning difficulties, disabilities, and those kind of areas. How can we create a democratic process of research? So how can we include PARC and ARCH, but also how can we make sure the findings go out to all members of the community? So the final couple of slides, and I'm going to keep it very quick because I'm conscious of the time, is actually my own position of being able to sort of visualize, make my research and experiences visual, music-based, video-based, and I will be sharing some links at the end. And ultimately, my kind of two concluding thoughts are less is more. Identifying as an autistic research professional, father and me, has been a huge part of my research, my journey. I'm conscious of not being a gatekeeper, that I'm an expert on my own autism, and I may have insight into the experience of others, but the key is to ask them. Communication has to be inclusive and person-centered. Interviews especially interviews, can be whatever the participant wants them to be. Can we use interest and creativity to share and discuss our experiences? Can we move away from stereotypes of autism? But actually, as the ethical research process has shown, it's made me question who the sort of move away from stereotypes, who are the rigid ones? And ultimately, I see myself now as an autistic and autism research, which is, it's about bridging those two areas together. Just a couple of links now. I've got my email address here, which I'm happy to share. I'm also part of the ARCH group, which is a Bishop Gross Test autism research resources and community hub, which is something I'm really proud of. And I just want to thank Kate and Phil as well. And that's my presentation. Oh,
That's on mute. Got another presentation now before we have a Q&A together. And it's quite an interesting contrast because there's overlaps in terms of some of the topics discussed, but quite different methodologies being used here. So I know George, our next presenter, quite well because I was supervisor on this project, one of them. So and I have worked with George in the past, and currently on various things. So we've got the relationship between autistic identity and the quality of life of autistic adults. So over to you, George.
Thank you. I'm assuming everyone can see and hear me and see my screen okay.
We can.
I think Damien's the only one I can see, so nod if you can, thank you. So I'm George Watts. I'm an autistic PhD student at the University of Stirling, where I've just started a PhD, which is looking at the autistic community. But today I'm going to be talking to you about some research I did for my master's, which was at the University of Kent, and as Damien mentioned, was supervised by Em. I need to give a bit of a trigger warning at this point because I'm going to be mentioning some things which reflect more deficit-based attitudes towards autistic people, which some people might find upsetting. So I'm going to start by looking at the historical context of autism research. So historically, almost all autism research has been within that deficit-based negative autism as tragedy model, which is very much aligned with the medical model of disability. So it sees being autistic as a condition which needs to be treated. The autistic person needs to change, often to try to make them seem more like non-autistic people. But since the early 90s, autistic self-advocates have been really challenging these ideas, and particularly with the use of the internet. This has led to the neurodiversity paradigm, which is much more aligned with the social model of disability. So this sees being autistic as a different but equally valid way of being. And this shift has really created a demand for autism research to firstly consider the perspectives of autistic people through things like participatory research, and also to recenter research on outcomes which are about autistic well-being rather than trying to change autistic people. So I rather like the way that Peter Vermeulen put this. The goal of autism research shouldn't be to make people less autistic, but to make them autistically happy. But how do we define autistic happiness? So I think one way is to look at quality of life research. So quality of life is this very broad, holistic concept that involves a lot of different aspects of life. And when we're talking about autistic quality of life, it's really important to consider, well, what is a good autistic quality of life? Because almost all the tools we have, the measures to capture quality of life, are really designed by non-autistic people for non-autistic people, and might not therefore actually reflect what a good positive autistic quality of life would look like for an autistic individual. So the research we have has really consistently shown that autistic people have worse quality of life than their non-autistic peers. And this has led to research which is questioning, okay, so why is this happening? Why do autistic people have a worse quality of life? And here are just some of the things which have been suggested as predicting quality of life for autistic people. And the one I was particularly interested in was autistic identity. And I think particularly as an autistic person, this really reflected my views and those of many autistic people I know, that autistic identity more. How do we define autistic identity? What do we mean when I say autistic identity? How do we define identity more generally? So I've got a definition here. So it's the way a person understands and views himself and is often viewed by others. And I think the second half of that is really vacuum. It's something that's formed in relation to how other people also perceive us. And so for autistically important, so this is where we needed the trigger warning. This is one example, I've gone a bit too far there. So Insel described autism as a tremendously disabling brain disease, which really robs a child and a family of the personhood of this child. And at the time, Insel was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, which is the largest mental health research organisation in the world. And so you can see why perspectives like this create what Goffman called a stigmatised identity. And even though this is a very dated opinion, and hopefully people wouldn't say things like this these days, these ideas still go a very long way before you find anything that's more positive. Autistic people, however, have expressed some other different views. So this is a quote from Raymaker, which really relates autistic identity to the concept of neurodiversity. And we see the same here in this quote from Bagatelle, who describes one of her participants as creating a positive autistic identity really through engagement with the autistic community. Or as Martijn Dekker put it very simply, in finding each other, we found ourselves. And I think it's interesting that all three. Yeah.
George, sorry, can I interrupt there? Are you happy to turn your camera off to see if that supports with strengthening your Wi-Fi, if that's okay?
I can.
Perfect, thank you. And then it should be fine. That should support. Thank you.
Is that better?
That is better, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry if I was breaking up before. There is also a recording of this. It'll be fine. So all three of these reflect that reciprocal relationship between autistic identity and the community. So hopefully you can see why I'm now doing a PhD looking at the autistic community. And it comes back to that shift from a more deficit-based negative perspective of being autistic towards seeing being autistic as an identity, as something that can be more positive or at least neutral. So the research we have on autistic identity so far suggests that belonging to a stigmatized identity group has been linked with worse mental health, but also that having that positive autistic social identity is something that's good for autistic mental health. We know that many autistic people have difficulties with mental health, and that this positive identity can be a protective mechanism. There's also this research by McDonald, which I'm going to be talking about a fair bit today, and she found that autistic identity led to improvements in education and employment, as well as in quality of life. So these are the things which led to my hypothesis. So I started off with this idea that having that better sense of autistic identity would be linked with a higher quality of life. But I realized really early on that there was a potential issue here where the most common criticism of the neurodiversity paradigm is that these ideas only really apply to more able autistic people, that people with high support needs don't necessarily benefit from concepts like an autistic identity. So I realized I needed to measure people's support needs as well. And so my hypothesis really evolved. So I'm still looking to see whether that sense of autistic identity was linked with a higher quality of life. But I wanted to see whether that was independent of the impact on quality of life of people's support needs. So to do this, I used an online survey. I used convenience sampling, so mostly through things like Twitter. And the three key things I wanted information about was people's quality of life, their autistic identity, and their support needs. And you can see from my inclusion criteria there that I included self-identified autistic people, which, as we heard in the previous talk, this is something that is being done increasingly now in autism research, as we recognise there are so many barriers for people to access a formal diagnosis. So to measure quality of life, I use these three measures. So there's the Hucol-Breath, which is an extremely well-established measure of quality of life from the World Health Organization. It's the short form of the Hucol 100. And I use the Hucol-Dis, which is a disability-specific add-on module designed to be used with the Hucol-Breath or Hucol 100. And in addition to those two, I used a measure called the ASCOL, and I'm a big fan of this. It's, as far as I know, still the only autism-specific quality of life measure out there. And you can really tell that it's been designed with autistic people, not just for us. So it comes back to the point I made about how do we know what we're measuring is a good autistic quality of life, or is it something that's more neuronormative that we're measuring? And I think that's really exemplified in this question here. So where they ask, are you satisfied with your current friendships? I think if it were a non-autism specific measure of quality of life, they might well ask something like, well, how many friends do you have? Or how often do you see your friends? But in the ASCOL, they ask, well, are you satisfied with your current friendships? And they specify, it doesn't matter sort of how many you have, it's about, are you happy with what you've got? And I think that really captures the nuance of autistic quality of life and creates a much better measure. So to measure autistic identity, I did struggle to find a measure which had been validated in the literature of autistic identity. But I used this one called the ACEs, which is from that study by McDonald, and where she found that autistic identity did have that positive relationship with quality of life. So I wanted to see whether I could replicate her findings. And this consists of 4 subscales. So there's the positive difference subscale, which is really that sense of being autistic is an okay thing. Then there's the context dependent subscale, which looks at whether people feel they're more autistic in some situations than in others. There's spectrum abilities, which is where people associate their strengths with being autistic. And there's changeability, where people feel they can change how autistic they are, they can minimize their challenges in relation to being autistic. So I'm going to be talking about these some more. My last measure was support needs. Now, again, I struggled to find a measure that I felt was a good fit. So other studies have used things like IQ or the autism quotient, and I didn't feel like these were a great fit for what I was trying to measure and also for the potential support needs of the participants I anticipated getting. So I ended up designing my own measure of support needs. So these are the different areas I asked them about, and some of these are really well established in the literature, others are less so. So things like caring for others, as we've heard, there's now more research on things like the experiences of autistic parents. And I've included things like informal psychological support, because while we know autistic people have psychological support needs, we also know that mental health services are typically not ideal for autistic people. And so many autistic people do depend on more informal psychological support. So to give you an example of what this looked like, I asked people how often they needed support in these areas, and I did specify it wasn't about whether they actually received that support or not. So this question here relates to executive functioning difficulties they might have. So I had 382 lovely participants who took the time to complete my survey. As you can see here, I had an interesting spread of gender identities. I've just got a message saying my internet connection is unstable, so I'm hoping you can still hear me as I speak into the void here. So it's fairly common in online survey studies for women to be overrepresented, and this huge number of autistic people who identified as other genders might reflect the tendency in autistic people to be more likely to be gender non-conforming. I had about 2/3 of my participants who were formally diagnosed, and in terms of people's co-occurring conditions, the spread here really reflects what is seen in the wider literature. So I should add that the columns here add up to more than 100% because people can be in more than one group. So this really reflects what is seen in the wider literature, the number of co-occurring conditions autistic people typically have. So moving on to the results, I used regression analysis to look at these results. And I initially looked at the relationship between people's support needs and the ACEs score. So the ACEs is that measure of identity. So looking at that, people's support needs did have a significant relationship with quality of life, but the overall ACEs score didn't. And so that led me to look at the ACEs subscales instead, which was more useful. And so you can see here, for people who aren't as enamored with numbers, what we're looking at, that column that says B, that's beta on the left-hand column. And what that means is if a score in that category goes up by 1, the impact on quality of life will be affected by the number in that beta column. So if people had a support needs score that was 1 higher than the next person, their quality of life in terms of the probability is incredibly likely to be 0.5 point lower on the quality of life measures. So we can see here that the positive difference subscale had a positive impact on quality of life, as did the changeability subscale, but the context dependent subscale had a negative impact on quality of life, which is interesting. So to see whether this still applied regardless of people's support needs, I divided my data into 2 groups. So I used a median split and I ran those analyses again, looking at the different groups, and I found that same pattern. So people's support needs obviously had an impact on their quality of life, but these other aspects of the ACEs measure still had an impact, and that was there for both people with high and with low support needs. So to get away from the numbers to something a bit more visual, this shows where people's support needs impacted in terms of their quality of life, and that relationship between seeing being autistic as a positive difference and their quality of life. So the blue line here are people with lower support needs, as well as the blue dots, the participant scores. And the pink line is people with higher support needs. So you can see that while people with higher support needs did overall have those lower quality of life scores, that line is still trending upwards. It's still got that same sort of curve. In fact, it's slightly steeper for people with high support needs. So it shows that that impact of having that positive autistic identity was true for both groups, and that still had that same impact on quality of life. So because of the discrepancies between those different subscales of the ACEs, I then looked at this question within the ASCOL. So this question wasn't scored as part of the quality of life scoring. And this asks, are you at ease with being autistic as an aspect of your identity? And for me, that is really at the heart of what I mean by a positive autistic identity. And so I wanted to see how this compared to the ACEs results. And when I ran a correlation, I found that answers to this ASCOL question correlated positively with 2 of the subscales, but negatively with the other 2. So that raises some interesting questions about what that ACEs measure is actually measuring, whether that's measuring autistic identity. So to summarize my findings, I found that people with higher support needs, unsurprisingly, had lower quality of life. And I found that there was that positive relationship between people with more positive autistic identity scores, which predicted the higher quality of life. And also when I looked at it in terms of that ASCOL question 9 measure about whether people are at ease with being autistic as an aspect of their identity, I found the same relationship in the regression models where that also predicted the better quality of life. And so I found that this was true for both people with high and low support needs. So I was able to accept my hypothesis that it did have that effect on quality of life. So a couple of things I'd like to draw out from that data. That key finding there, that this positive impact applied for both people with high and low support needs, really contradicts that neurodiversity narrative. And it'd be great if future research could see if we could replicate these findings. Another thing that really sort of puzzled me is this changeability subscale. So this is looking at whether people feel they can change how autistic they are, which is really problematic in itself. But I found it strange that it also replicated McDonald's findings, that there was this positive relationship with quality of life. And I wondered whether it was an example of people feeling they could change themselves in order to be less autistic, and that could reflect masking. But then if that's what's happening, it doesn't really make sense that it's improving their quality of life, because that doesn't fit with what we know on the research on masking being really detrimental to autistic people. So it'd be really interesting if other research is able to replicate these findings and try and find out what's going on there. In terms of how this fits within the wider research context, so the finding that people's higher support needs predicted worse quality of life contradicts findings by this one paper by Arentia and Reyes. So they found that how disabled people were didn't predict their quality of life. It was rather their quality of support which predicted quality of life in that study, which really contradicts my findings. And I think it's probably because of the way that we measured people's support needs. So they used the AQ and a measure of IQ, which is very different from my support needs measure. My findings also fit really well with the research we have on autistic identity and mental health. And it suggests that maybe that positive role of autistic identity might impact on other aspects of quality of life rather than just the emotional well-being, mental health aspects of quality of life. So again, it would be useful if future research could look at which aspects of quality of life are impacted by autistic identity. And finally, this really fits with what autistic people say. So there's a lot of autism research these days, which is really just validating what autistic people have been saying for years and reflecting that knowledge back in a more empirical way. There are, of course, limitations to this study. So a key one is one of representation. So my participants don't represent the autistic population as a whole. In particular, autistic people with intellectual disabilities might not have been able to access the survey, and the gender balance that I had might not reflect the wider autistic population. There's also a risk of confounding variables. So all those other things people have used to predict quality of life, I wasn't able to measure those or control for them. And things like co-occurring conditions. So if people had things like ADHD as well as being autistic, that might well have impacted on things like the support needs measure. The support needs measure itself is a potential limitation because it isn't something that has been validated. I was able to calculate the internal consistency, and it did have a high internal consistency, but I wasn't able to do other psychometric tests on this measure. And finally, the ASCOL, there's been some recent research which has suggested that the ASCOL might underestimate the quality of life of autistic women. So all of these factors might have had an impact on my results and how they should be interpreted. I'd also like to talk briefly about the strengths of this study. So I had a lot of feedback from participants. At the bottom of each page of the survey, I had a comments box which people used, and I'd really love to be able to analyze all the comments I had in there. But there were some themes which really came out of that. And the first one is that people were really just happy about the nature of the study. They felt that this was an important topic, it was important to them. And so they're really grateful that actually it just was being researched. And I got a lot of comments about what I've defined here as cultural competence. So I think this is where, as an autistic researcher, being able to take the time and really think about the wording of the survey and how it was structured, how things might be interpreted by autistic participants, I think that was a real strength. So things like the language choices, at the very start of the survey, people were able to select whether they wanted to see the survey written in terms of identity first language, person first language, or using the term Spurgers. And so giving them that control over the language they saw, even though that created more work in terms of writing 3 different versions of the survey, I think that was something that was really useful. I also had a lot of feedback about the way I asked people about their identity. So I've been given permission to share this tweet that someone very generously put about this question to selecting from a finite number of genders. So I asked them to simply describe their gender in their own terms. And again, while this created more work in terms of encoding that data afterwards, I think this is something that was really important to people. And another thing I'm passionate about is really building those bridges between the autistic community and the research community, because there is a lot of animosity there, and for good reason. And finally, people were really happy that I included self-identified autistic people, because even though there are good reasons to include them as research participants, this still doesn't happen enough. So I hope that future researchers are able to use some of these strengths and build on that. And finally, in conclusion, so where do we go from here? I think the key thing to come out of this is we need to change that narrative. It wouldn't be a research presentation if I didn't say we needed a lot more research. So it'd be great if we had more research to see if these findings can be replicated and explore them further. But we also need researchers to really consider both the language they use and the ideas which underpin what research they do, why they're doing that type of autism research. And since we have this link between a more positive autistic identity and quality of life, I think if we go a step back, if we go back to those negative narratives and more positive perceptions of being autistic, these are the things which are influencing autistic people's identities. And so if we continue to only describe autistic people in deficit-based terms, then I think that is going to have an impact on identity and then on quality of life. And the same applies to practice. I particularly love this paper by Brown et al., which looks at how diagnosticians can support a neurodiversity perspective from the start. And I think all professionals who are working with autistic people in any capacity, if we can change those narratives so that they are more positive and create those more positive autistic identities, I think the long-term effect of that is something that could be hugely valuable for the well-being of autistic people. So that is me. I have some slides of different references, which I'm just going to skip through quickly, but you can contact me for a copy of these. And finally, there are my contact details. I'm going to attempt to stop sharing and turn my screen back on and hope my internet doesn't give up the ghost. There. Are we now taking questions?
Yeah. So some questions coming through. I'll just read this one out. From Amy Fletcher. This is really fascinating. Great to see another emancipatory project in practice. I think this is for Daniel. I know you have collectively used participatory, emancipatory, and democratic methodology, but how do you differentiate or separate these? Do you see them as different or the same as an autistic researcher?
That's a good question. So in the initial kind of design and kind of identifying and thinking about how I wanted the research to kind of develop, I used participatory and emancipatory as a starting point. Increasingly, I'm now sort of heading towards this kind of like the that they don't have to be exclusive, that one is about the kind of before, and the democratic aspect is about the dissemination of information. So one of the things I'm really conscious of is lots of research gets created, but how is it disseminated? How do we make sure the research that we create is accessible for everyone, including the members of the autism community who it's about? So yeah, so I think it's a sort of just kind of almost filtering those principles into it when I'm designing, thinking about how I want the research to run, and also when I start the process of asking the participants how do they want it to run and what do they want the kind of end result to look like.
I remember that some of the old disability studies researchers questioned whether any research is fully emancipatory. They set pretty high standards, some of them,
Yeah,
in terms of impact of research and actually making a difference in the lives of disabled people. Participatory perhaps might be slightly less about high standards, but it's still about shifting the power balance. Is a big part of the
totally.
whole idea. And democratic is, I guess, another way of putting that.
Yeah, and I think it's all part of that kind of the steps that things like this, the PARC of kind of what the amazing thing about these kind of networks and PARC and stuff is that it's the first step. It's a hugely positive step, and it's going in the right direction.
So, question for George. If your sample was self-selecting via Twitter, which has an active neurodiversity community in which you're involved, and if you included self-identified people who have chosen to adopt being autistic into a sense of identity, couldn't someone argue that your research is circular because people probably wouldn't self-identify or join Twitter if this didn't improve their quality of life in the first place?
I think that's a really good question. Yeah, I think really the convenient sampling method was just that. It was convenient while doing master's research. It was a quick and easy way to access autistic people. If I were to do it again, I would probably look at other ways to access different autistic people, because I think there probably is a huge bias in the sort of autistic people who follow me on Twitter really don't necessarily represent the autistic population as a whole. So yeah, I think David makes a very good point there.
Be interesting to see, though, to replicate the research in a wider sample, perhaps, or in different community settings, because I struggle to see in some ways how internalizing a deficit model about oneself is particularly going to be beneficial to well-being. But it's how does that work in practice and what difference it makes needs further research, as you were saying at the end.
I think what's really interesting there is also to consider how this applies to autistic people with intellectual disabilities, because most of them don't have that sort of consider being autistic with an intellectual disability as a social identity. They are much more likely to reject that. And is that in relation to being exposed to those more negative narratives? Or is that because, yeah, so I think that's something that'd be really fascinating to explore in the future.
Different contexts. So for my son, for example, has severe intellectual disabilities, wouldn't know what the word autism really means. It's not that I wouldn't talk to him about it if possible. He'd just too abstract a concept, really. But for me, as a parent, people taking a more neurodiversity type of approach with him would greatly benefit his well-being. And support strategies and so on. But he's the very kind of person who's most likely to get remedial therapies and whatnot foisted upon them. So you get really tricky debates there. It's showing the benefit of taking these approaches. But I really like having some findings coming through in this, because we're making recommendations, say in the National Autistic Task Force, about autistic identity, and we need some research to support this to the people who don't intuitively just get it. Got a question for Dan. Please, could you share any examples of more autism-friendly assessment methods?
Okay, yeah, so because I'm generally working with creatives, I'm opening it up to try and include their sort of interests. So, for instance, if there was someone who was a computer game designer, that actually is a way to incorporate the process of coding, game design. Musicians, the idea is like an album, for instance. Also, like illustrators, artists, playwrights, that we're just kind of coming up with something that allows the participant to kind of communicate their experience, their ideas in a way that they're happy with. And this is presented like barriers in terms of the ethical review process. So I'm constantly working with my supervisors to kind of look at this, but that's the kind of the dream end point, really, is that it's a totally unique sharing of information.
Question. Oh, George is typing an answer. But you might want to respond to that as well, George. When you've got time. There's a practical question about missing contact details, I guess, in the chat. I'm not sure how to capture those because the chat's quite fast moving. We may need to capture people who want to share contacts and interests and so on some other way. But that's something to think about, I think, in helping people connect with one another. So one to ponder, I think, how to keep track of all of that. There's a question there for Daniel. You talked about autism and my autism a lot. Have you considered the implications of this in comparison to talking about being autistic or my experience as an autistic person?
Yeah, I guess the sort of language I use is deliberate and it relates to me. And one of the aspects of participatory approaches and my approach is that ultimately it's the individual's experience and individual's kind of parameters, and it's just how I refer to it. And increasingly it's something I've kind of sort of like to take ownership of how I experience the world. And one of the things I was really keen to sort of stress in this presentation, that it is my own ideas, it's my own thoughts, and that other people have different ideas, and that's fine. It's about that kind of my own positionality and taking the time to understand how others experience it and other people experience, and define their sort of experiences how they wish to.
I quite like the second one there, with that sort of issue of my experience as an autistic person, or claiming the autistic identity as a more solidarity with the community, but my experience is this, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So people take different approaches with this. I can see why various things against my autism as a thing, connotations potentially, but it's a tricky one, these identity and language issues. I do a whole talk on it, on that topic alone. Just fine. Gone slightly over, but I think we've covered the Q&A questions, but you may want to also look into the chat comments if you have time in the break. Some interesting parallels between the talks there, but quite different methodologies applied, as I said at the start. And I think the traditions in positivist number crunching research has often done autistic people not many favors, but when used well, they can indicate things on a more generalized level, essentially. And I think more realist theories and approaches might be better justifications for using some of these methods. And there's been some good recent articles on using realist approaches. Marianne Corti in a recent presentation on one of our PARC conferences by Monique Botha. So do look those up. And some really interesting stuff there on from Daniel about positionality and really reflecting on that. And yeah, I mean, the depth you were going into is kind of what qualitative researchers ought to be doing, in a sense, in self-reflection, but often is not followed through fully. But is there something about our autistic ways of working which actually well suited to that?
Yeah.
The comment from Lynnae, I want my next study to be mixed methods, so I like numbers. I mean, this is the thing, some do like playing with statistics and numbers. But mixed methods can also be useful, depends on the purpose of the study. Well, I better let you all have a bit of a comfort break and a bit of a shift in focus in this afternoon's talks after our next break. So we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. So see you soon. Just slightly running over time, so I'm going to quickly hand over to Nathan. So over to you, Nathan.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, hello. Thank you very much for coming to my presentation, and we'll see the whole event. I'm very grateful to be able to speak to you today. So as being said, my name is Nathan Keats. The title of this presentation is Exploring the Benefits of Participation in Improv Comedy for Autistic Adults. Let's go. So I'll introduce the key concepts here, talk about the methods, present the findings, and go into the discussion and conclusion. So let's begin with the introduction. Improv comedy is a small subset of theatrical improvisation, whereby people perform live scenes or songs through premeditated or spontaneously created games for the purpose of story creation or producing comedic sketches. This is a loose definition, and some people will actually engage in a more broader theatrical improvisation that still may fit this definition. There have been a variety of ways to implement theatrical improvisation, the broader term, and this term will be used to suggest the broader improvisation within a theatrical context, such as live action role play, clown, social skills interventions whereby improvisation games were an aspect, and directly improv classes that were run. And these can be found in my paper that's under review. Most of the literature can be associated with theatrical improvisation, or rather, most of the literature that has been associated with theatrical improvisation has been about autistic children. Most of the outcomes these studies discuss are about social and communication skills. In my study, where I surveyed improvisers from around the world, which is another paper under review, I confirmed that social and communication skills are developed for all respondents. In this survey, that was mostly non-disabled people and non-autistic people. This suggests that both non and autistic people may gain similarly in relation to this area of skill development. Additionally, surveyed resulted in confirming improv had added value to people's lives, they gained a sense of community and a sense of relaxation. Therefore, it was interesting to query what gains autistic people may experience that are this or similar to non-autistic people. So the aims of this study was it sought to answer whether improv has an effect for autistic adults in their lives. Specifically, it explored a few aims, but today I will focus on the first one, which is if the participants believe there had been any benefits from participating in any improv, and improv being the specific term here. The methods. So I had 20 participants, so running 20 interviews, 10 of which were with autistic, 5 non-autistic yet neurodivergent, and 5 neurotypical improvisers. As we can see, I have a wide range of participants' ages here, 24 to 79. The gender split was, hopefully not split, but 8 females, 9 males, and 3 non-binary. However, most participants were Caucasian. So these were semi-structured interviews where the schedule was formed through the support of an autistic consultation group. I also piloted the schedule and redrafted it to hone the schedule itself. After gaining ethical approval, I recruited autistic people through social media and snowball sampling and used qualitative content analysis to generate the themes. Okay. The findings, this is quite dense, so I'll go slowly. There's a number of themes, 7 themes emerged from the data for autistic improvisers. These were personal importance of improv, performance skills and other platforms for application and development, enables you to roll with it and take risks. I've gone full autistic and can learn why neurotypicals are like they are, good for mental health, gaining social and communication skills, improved quality of life, empowered self, access to community and personal development. The first theme then, personal importance of improv. It can provide a happier, more fulfilling life and can do so in all aspects of life as well. A quote here, but personally I think, yeah, in terms of my own experience, it's been an absolute kind of a lightning bolt shot through the arm of, oh, I can take everything I learn improv, apply it to my own life and ultimately become like a happier person. Improv can make life more fun and be an escape as well. Improv was described as my way of life and how I see the world, so it's necessary for them. One person couldn't just access information within themselves, so in order to engage in life, they need to improvise their whole life anyway. Furthermore, some people have been doing improv for so long that it was part of their life naturally. It's how they live their life. So it's necessary for others, and for others, it's a job. They were paid to perform in improv and tour around, or it's part of their job, if not directly their job. Oh, here we go. Performance skills and other platforms for application and its development through improv. They gain skills and comfort at improvising, performance and comedy. In addition, they develop non-performance skills such as teaching, creating a dynamic classroom, technical theatre, accessing the other side of the stage, and in sales as well. So they were using improv to help sales. It seems to help in forming other creative endeavors. So numerous autistic improvisers engage in D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. Some engage in art, and writing was quite common. So a quote that links some of these. Yes, but I'm also Chief Creative Officer with the company that's developing this character builder app, and which also promotes the fact that improv helps with leadership. A third theme enables you to roll with it and take risks. So it taught me that everything happens by accident. So trying things and go beyond your boundaries. This participant quote here says, when you're growing up with autism, you tend to become very set in your ways. Like, for example, like food. I was definitely very picky with food when I was younger. So yeah, and then lo and behold, there were certain dishes that was like, this is great. So this participant in particular, I went on a holiday and found out that they had to eat seafood and actually really enjoyed the type of food. Improv helps with rolling with it, being open and flexible, and helps acceptance of others and their ideas, no judgments. This goes both ways, helping others be accepting of you and you of them and their ideas, and having no judgment within the space. Fourth theme, I've gone full autistic and can learn why neurotypicals are like they are. Improv seems to help with being their autistic selves due to being accepted and potentially being where autistic communication is accepted. And this was remarked by one person specifically about autistic communication. It's quite an interesting one about how this aspect of acceptance or other aspects of improv allows for autistic communication to happen. Improv identifies autistic strengths, as this participant said. I think for autistic adults, it gives you a place where, you know, what else? A place where other places in life, your natural way of being might seem odd or strange. In improv, that can be a real bonus. Being autistic is beneficial to improv in that sense. Opportunities for more of a complete understanding of self, neurotypicals, and the world. This can obviously happen through the practice of being other people. You understand yourself more, others, and understand the world more. And one person also teaching improv found that they understood that what neurotypicals do through the more normative aspects of improv. Additionally, improv has a structure and rules that are useful, however loose these may be. And the fifth theme is for mental health. So some people found less depression, anxiety, or stress. The quote here is, I think it helped me relax. So I've said about the anxiety, but actually I think one of the positive things was it helped me lighten up and go, sod it. Acceptance from others and transforming emotions helps mental health. And the quote here, I actually think it might upset meltdowns. I seem to sort of regenerate and sort of not end up in a meltdown. So yeah, I don't know whether it works for everyone. This is actually linked to the acceptance because they attended a session, an improv session, and knew that they were verging on having a meltdown and just asked for the lights to be dimmed, and this was permitted due to understanding the needs. The sixth theme is gaining social and communication skills. Aspects of social development were mentioned, for example, social cues, focus on useful social information over everything. So this acknowledges their local processing preference, and then being able to understand what bits of information are more important. Another participant thought they developed socially appropriate behaviors, which could be linked to more of a negative discourse or way of looking at being autistic. Social confidence was gained, and improv as a skill directly applicable to life and social situations. This is about tricking yourself into doing something, just improvising the moment. Communication developments. The examples provided are alternative to eye contact instead of looking at the eyes, looking at the eyebrows. Non-verbal communication, mirroring, including emotions, mirroring someone's emotions helps. Being able to ask for clarification, and this links to other aspects of the themes, and specifically the next theme, which we'll go to now. The seventh theme and the last theme is improved quality of life, empowered self, access to community, and personal development. Emotional well-being, ability to be oneself and gaining interpersonal connections. The quote here, just be confident in myself and speaking and just being, you know, self-determination, which may well link to that last quote as well. personal control, creative autonomy and choices, the quote here, really allows a certain amount of freedom, which is not always present in everyday interactions, because you always have to monitor what you're saying. Personal development, cognitive competence, practical skills, flexibility of thought, being relaxed and self-control, and using one's brain. The quote that I can just offer, albeit not on screen this time, is, and for me, improv instrumental in edging me away from that kind of rigidity. So what does this really mean? So today I set out to explore the benefits of improv. The findings indicate a wide scope of potential benefits for autistic people engaging in improv. Nonetheless, there is scope to comment on the experience of improv in comparison to other beneficial or hindering aspects of their lives, but this is beyond the presentation today, although I may to pass a minor comment later. Quite key here is quality of life. Based on Sherlock and colleagues' 2002 domains of quality of life, we can look at social inclusion as well. Improv as a community of practice. There is the autistic community as well, and that could be involved here, especially if you're involved with other autistic improvisers. However, most participants weren't in this study. The community roles, being a teacher within improv, was mentioned, right? So this aspect of acceptance provides a mutual respect, dignity, and equality to some extent, and material well-being. So some of the participants had employment status through improv or using improv in their employment. At the forefront of the study, we did see some quality of life domains clearly in the themes because I highlighted them being so dominant in the interviews. Personal development, self-determination, interpersonal relations, and emotional well-being were found. However, there wasn't any physical well-being. Any aspects that were linking to this was actually discussing psychological and emotional well-being. More broadly, well-being, autistic people may gain both hedonistic and eudaimonic well-being. Hedonistic well-being is concerned with happiness, eudaimonic well-being is concerned with living well or self-actualizing full human potential through reciprocity. The fun that people state as a reason to be a begin improv is not the only benefit, which obviously links to hedonistic well-being. They connect with people, collaborating, developing with the community, and giving to others through co-creative, social emergent humor and or theatrical experiences, which is related to eudaimonic well-being. Psychological well-being, which is just a more broad term here, and possible health benefits can be gained from having a rich life of full purpose and meaning, continued growth and quality connections to others. And giving to others leads to a meaningful life, which is all part of this eudaimonic well-being. In improv, we can see it as a form of rehearsal and developing understanding, social understanding of situations or life more generally. Improv is a form of practice of all those occurrences that may or may never exist. So if you're doing naturalistic scene work, you could literally be practicing what you may encounter, or could be using fantastical scenarios which still could relate, but it might be less transferable directly. It is the othering defined by human development. Winnicott in 1953 was speaking about this. We understand ourselves in line with our experiences, therefore we know ourselves by what is not me, or the not me encounters, which is related to child development, but I'm just elaborating and using this more so for my purposes here. In improv, performers explore moments disconnected or connected from themselves, discovering the present and possibly being in relation to it. Through this self-discovery and exploration of the natural scene work or fantastical theatrical play, that's a bit of a typo there, improvisers can develop understandings. Eudaimonic well-being, as per Deci and Ryan, suggests living well or actualizing one's human potentials, understanding what facilitates one's potential, increases our psychological well-being. For example, being accepted as autistic and having creative outlets or release could be perceived as self-actualizing. Improvisers can envision the future and the potential of oneself by means of personal growth. However, as Burton and Fisher, a multi-level approach to well-being whereby accounting for all aspects of life would be beneficial, such as environmental factors, such as the culture, autistic culture perhaps, and also structural and systemic barriers. Proposing that improv will not be enough for people in a life with other difficulties. For example, discrimination, internal or external to improv, which would be prejudice, or a stigmatized identity, such as with self and social or public stigma. And this relates to the labeling theory. So autistic people learning of the negative narrative about themselves may promote being that identity over them just being themselves. And I think this is important to acknowledge as we think about this work. So the study does have limitations as a qualitative study. Some ideas need further identifying through alternative methods. For example, whether autistic communication truly is fully accepted and included in improv, if that is true or not. I would suggest different pedagogies of improv would lead to different results. As some participants stated, improv may not work for other autistic people and is not a panacea, so it will not help with everything, and that's really important to say. So there's many directions we could take this work. I have many ideas for this, but here's some key points about where this can and has actually been taken. Exploring how to implement teaching of improv for autistic adults. So I've looked at this already. Identifying to what extent various models of quality of life and well-being are impacted. Investigating what value improv has for autistic people that are learning, and for example, within a study, not retrospective about their experiences, which is also something I've looked into, and identifying the mental health benefits of autistic adults learning improv. So to conclude, this is a novel approach and first study of its kind. Improv could be a safe environment for autistic people to gain benefits, and improv impacts autistic people's quality of life based on this qualitative analysis of their experience. I am noticing that I've managed to speak quite quickly because I'm at the end. So I'll still say thank you for listening. And my contact details are on screen, as well as the nod that I'm open to postdoc opportunities. Thank you very much. Yeah, I do realize I managed to get through that really quickly.
That's okay. Not sure we've got any questions in the Q&A as yet. So if people want to have a think and ask Natalie and Nathan a question, we've got a few minutes left.
Can I just make a comment while people are thinking? That
Yeah.
I just found this sort of creativity side that we've been exploring in this final section of the conference absolutely fascinating and just really very, very important. And it's something that I think we perhaps could take forward as a special interest group of some sort within PARC, because there are plenty of people around with an interest in this area of research. And I think within PARC, there's quite a lot of that possibility for special interest groups, because currently PARC is convened in regions, but there are all sorts of ways of connecting with each other, aren't there? So thank you very much for that. I thought it was lovely.
Online events like this are reaching internationally, and
yeah, exactly,
building those networks up, and interest groups has always sort of petered out and something's happening, and there's various groups that have formed of late. There's a stigma research network that formed, for example. But I think I said in the chat earlier, I'll have a think and get a posting up on the PARC website just for people showing an interest in this area. I mean, I've got a project idea myself that I want to build up, which will need creative input. So and quite a lot of it to make it work. So it's getting everyone together on specific topics will be a useful way forward, especially as we grow bigger.
Yeah, and I feel really strongly that the originators who set up PARC and the regional conveners can't do everything, and it's a collective anyway. So if there are people who want to take a lead on particular things, then that's really welcome, isn't it, Damien?
Yeah, so if people want to help organise events, whether in person in future or online, or whether it's regionally or topic based, then we can look into that, and PARC can help publicise and so on. So do keep ideas coming in.
Excellent.
We can work together on them as well. And I think, given the response the IARF event had in the spring, which was huge, 3-day event full of brilliant work, it just shows that more of this is needed. We've also had Autism Arts Festival in Kent a couple of times, and that was really good. And I just think the time is more than come to bring a lot of this together and do some really interesting work.
And the collaborative writing is actually an important aspect of it, or collaborative publication, because obviously writing isn't the only way to publish research and so on. So I think making those connections about people who can collaborate in that way is really good. And we're, Damien and I, are already talking to Neil about some event around creativity. So, you know, it'd be lovely to take this forward.
So just looking at the Q&A, there's questions coming for our speakers. So getting back on track. So question from Chris here, Nathan. Is there any reason you chose improv over other creative forms? So why improv?
Yes. So this, essentially I've been doing improv for about over 16 years. So I was interested in how I was originally interested in how this works, and I taught improv in 2007 in America to autistic children. It's only recently that I've academically been looking at it, and I think there was a difference between scripted theatre and improvised theatre or improv comedy. I do think there is a difference, and that's because there's more of a direct need to have that interactional dialogue with others, and there's many other aspects to it as well. You're not using other people's words. It's much more about the self-expression and being free to be whatever you want to be in the moment. So if you want to be a gerbil climbing up a tree, do that. You don't need a script to do that. You can be whatever you want. And I think there's a lot more freedom in it, essentially. So I think there is definitely differences, and one of my participants who had done both improvised and scripted work found more difficulties with scripted theatre and the scripted theatre community than improvisers, and that's because improvisers are trained around some of the aspects that came out of this research and what I said at the beginning of my presentation about acceptance. In order to create the work, you have to be accepting of every single moment that happens. You need to engage in the process through these means, and you're not going to get that in scripted work necessarily, but that's from my perspective about it, and through the literature around improv. I don't think you could find that in literature around scripted theatre, although that might be debatable.
Thanks, Nathan. Got a question for Natalie. What's your ideal view of how someone should listen to your poem and what they should be doing mentally at the time?
Wow, what a fantastic question. I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive about that. I think the the work of listening resides in the listener, and the
You're frozen there.
and open up to taking things as they come. I was interested in what Nathan was saying just now about a kind of a liberation from not using other people's words, so this sense of scriptedness, because interestingly, in the process for making this, it's mostly found text works. I'm using other people's words. I've found that there's a kind of a liberation in that. I think I seem the act of making this as kind of an act of gleaning from an autist commons, really, and an act in therein of kind of expanding that kind of common repository. I was interested that Laura in the chat commented on neologism in Joyce, because the work that I opened with is all found text from Finnegan's Wake, including the wonderful word authenticitatum, which I think is so rich for thinking about, well, something could be an authentic expression, but also citational, also drawn from other people's materials. So yeah, lots to think on there. And yeah, please receive it how you will.
And then neologisms is something I've always liked conceptually. So as a child, if I didn't have a word for something, I'd make one up to fit the concept. And once at Autscape many years ago, I read out a short story made up of mainly neologisms. So it was fairly incomprehensible. It was
fantastic.
the entertainment evening.
There's that wonderful bit in Lynnae, isn't there, where he talks about if you want to communicate with an autistic person, you can just kind of acceptable will be a vague scrambled sound print. So the sense that communication it can be so much broader in our community. And yeah, I'd love to read that story.
I'll have to figure it out. There's a question here. In terms of development of sense of self, how would you say art and shared collectives of self-expression have helped you? And so any comments about how this has impacted on your own sense of selfhood, doing this kind of work?
I think for me, in my life, being free to be me has always been the central to who I am. You're not going to get me to do anything I don't want to do, really. So yeah, I trying to figure a way of saying this, but improvisation has been key to who I am from before I was even doing it, which is why when I found it, I was doing it in my more practitioner side of before I was doing academic stuff. So it's before all of this, from birth to now, spontaneity has been key. The lockdown has been difficult because spontaneity has been restricted quite heavily. I can't just do things anymore. So I hope that answers it in part, at least. So the answer is it's extremely integral to who I am: self-expression and freedom, and being weird. I guess the late great Dynamo's weirdness day. Like being weird is really, really important. You know, the liberation of just being free.
I think on this topic of authenticity and that authentic expression, I've been thinking quite a lot about the kind of selflessness, as well as and to kind of counter the authority that we have in authorship, which are two words kind of come from the same root. So one of my fascinations of this is the kind of the vanishing of the ego, and thinking about an egolessness process. Drawing on ideas in Buddhist philosophy, and also thinking about how some textual practices kind of have a kind of an anonymity to them, which I find kind of that I find a sense of strength from not viewing this as a kind of a self-expression, but as a kind of a plugging into a broader collectivity. And I was quite drawn to this moment in Catherine May's work, The Electricity of Every Living Thing, where it's quite a funny anecdote that she has this realization that she is the autistic person who runs into the toilets to hide, and she's there in the toilets of I think it's the Natural History Museum or the Science Museum. She's like, here I am vanishing, and I'm interested in that, both for its kind of moment of autist realization, but also it's a kind of sense of something of a construction of the self that's not helpful, that's vanishing. So yeah, so something about the expression of self, of a self disappearing, as well as an expression of a self, I think is important there. Thanks for the nice question.
Interesting stuff. I quite like this idea of tapping into a wider collective and playing with the pieces and fragments is very autistic to me. It's kind of putting this into something that speaks.
And it's been a process of finding community, really, the process of making this text as well. So yeah, I'm very grateful for that.
I need to leave now. Sorry.
Sorry, he had a question right at the end. Can the benefits of improv be affected by the size of the improv group and the composition, so comprised of non-autistic, autistic? And does the double empathy problem play a factor in how autistic people experience improv?
I will try and be extremely brief because I really do need to get to another meeting. Sorry. So yes, my last study has the idea of a small group to start with, but would certainly be beneficial. So a bigger size group might actually have negative consequences. And some autistic participants of an improv class may struggle to work with neurotypicals because of the double empathy, and the different neurotypes and different communication styles may impact it. However, that's not going to be true for everyone, because some people just need more encouragement. So even no matter your neurotype, it could be beneficial just to have someone with more experience to encourage you to be more playful and to go outside of the box thinking. And that's the quickest answer I can give. And I'm gonna leave now.
Yeah, sorry, no. And thanks everyone for another wonderful conference day. It's been a great set of events, and we have another workshop tomorrow evening. So hopefully some of you will be able to come to that. I know it's booked out. And look out for more events in the new year and keep in touch.